Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We have a very busy agenda, so I think it's good to start in time. We have interpretation, so as usually this meeting is web streamed, and we have interpretation in German, English, Greek, Hungarian, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, Swedish, Czech, Polish, Maltese and Croatian. Unfortunately, there's been some problems with Dutch and French that we have passively. So you can speak your language, but it will be difficult, there will be no interpretation to listen to. I would like to underline that since the beginning of its activity, our COVID Special Committee has favoured the presence in the room of invited speakers. I think that makes a lot of difference. But it's not always easy. And we start, Mr. Commissioner, now our second pillar of this mandate, that is the global perspective, and that makes it sometimes difficult for everybody to be in the room. But we're very happy that you are here. And also Dimitri and Nikhil from Doctors Without Borders will be present in the room, but Dr. Ugarte and Professor Moon will join remotely in the second session of today. If there are no comments, then the agenda can be adopted. Members should also be asked to approve the minutes for the committee meeting of the 10th and the 13th of October. If no objections are raised, the minutes are also adopted. Then I have a few announcements to make. Tomorrow we will have a second committee meeting in the morning with speakers from CEPI, the Deputy Health Minister for South Africa, the WTO and the World Health Organization. At yesterday's meeting of the committee coordinators, the following decisions were taken that are important for your committee work. First of all, we decided that an extension of the term of office of the committee for 3 months is necessary. So we will put forward a request for a decision to the Conference of Presidents accordingly. Coordinators have also decided to extend a second invitation to Mr. Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, for a hearing at our Commission. And we will launch an additional request to access to documents for all documents related to the preliminary negotiations of the joint procurement agreements for vaccines. And this includes especially those documents related at the third contract with Pfizer-BioNTech. And coordinators also agreed to submit a letter to the President of the European Parliament to request transparency on the third EU contract with Pfizer-BioNTech from Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen. And the coordinators endorsed the list of experts for the 3 hearings on democracy and fundamental rights. And these hearings will be organised in January and February of next year. And coordinators discussed also a draft timeline provided by the committee rapporteur, Mrs. Montserrat, and the time draft table will be provided to this committee in a timely fashion. Voilà. Let me... Mrs. Anderson, for a point of order?
Yes. You just made your announcement of the decisions of the coordinators, and to my knowledge, they also decided against extending another invitation to have Ursula von der Leyen to answer our questions. Did you not announce that because you forgot, or what's the reason for not announcing that decision?
Well, I announce decisions. If there are no decisions taken, I do not announce them. So on Ursula von der Leyen, there is no decision taken. Political groups will take that further into consideration, and we will come back to that in a later stage. Can I now proceed to point number 4, and that is our exchange of view with Commissioner Schinas. Very welcome. We're very happy to have you here. As I said in the beginning, this committee has 4 pillars. We more or less, not everything, some things will come back, but more or less finished the first pillar on the health policy, everything that happened in the European Union when it comes to the health issues domestically, I would say, and now we broaden our perspective to the global world. There you have an important responsibility. The adoption of the Global Health Strategy and the State of Preparedness report has been delayed, but the adoption is foreseen for the end of November, is that correct?
Yes.
Well, okay, very good. So then this is a timely discussion. I think it's good for us to hear what you have in preparation, how you look at things, and have an exchange of view with our committee members. So you can still take on board the insights that we have here. We have approximately an hour. That is not too much, but I think it's important that we give you the time for your introduction, and then we go to the political groups and the system as we are used to do. So I give you the floor for around about 10 minutes, Commissioner.
Thank you, dear Chair, honourable members. It's a pleasure and an honour to be with you. With many of you, our paths have crossed in this first leg of the mandate. Let me first start by expressing my grief on the millions of lives lost from COVID, both in Europe and worldwide. I think that when we discuss in this committee and when we discuss on this disease, we should never lose sight of what we are talking about. And we are talking about millions of lives lost, of course also millions of lives saved, but I think it's also a stark reminder how all these processes that we are dealing with at the EU level relate to the tragedy that has been unfolding in Europe and beyond since February 2020. Europe is again in a very difficult moment, difficult times. We are operating against an increasingly complex geopolitical backdrop. But as we navigate these complexities, we cannot forget that only yesterday, Europe and the world were on the brink of collapse because of the pandemic. And we should also not forget that this is not over. COVID-19 needs to remain in the spotlight, and this is why I welcome the contribution of this special committee to help us jointly secure the lessons learned, look ahead and prepare towards a more resilient future. Let me start with cooperation with the European Parliament. Since the beginning of the pandemic, our cooperation with the European Parliament has been crucial. And this was the main purpose of the contact group, which during one full year allowed many of us to maintain close and fruitful partnership towards a common objective, which is ultimately to preserve the health of Europeans and at the same time lead the global response in full solidarity. And I take this opportunity, Madam President, to thank you personally, but many other colleagues here present, for your remarkable work in the contact group. So when it comes to lessons learned, I think today, of course, the epidemiological situation is much better. The worst of the emergency is clearly behind us, but we still ignore how the virus evolves and mutates. Drawing lessons from the most acute phase is our overall objective to build a resilient, comprehensive European health union, hand in hand with this House. And I wish to congratulate this House and the Council for having delivered on the main building blocks of this new constellation that we like to call European Health Union. Mainly, the regulation and some of these agreements were accomplished only this week, so this is particularly timely. The agreement on the regulation on cross-border health threats, the revised and reinforced mandates for the ECDC, the regulation for the extra powers on HERA. With all these new instruments, Europe will become more effective, more resilient, more resistant. We will be able to respond more rapidly and more coordinated, if need be. And these instruments will leave no room to improvisation and uncertainty. some of which we experienced in the very early days of the pandemic. But as we enhance our internal preparedness, resilience and response capacity, we also at the same time need to complement it with robust and determined external action. Viruses know no borders, and our action will always be inefficient if it stops at borders. So it's now the moment, the time to move to this sustained approach, including the external dimension of health policy. And Madam Chair, as you just rightly said, on the 30th of November, the Commission, under the joint political responsibility of High Representative Vice President Borrell, myself, Commissioners Urpilainen and Kyriakides, we will be adopting a new global health strategy. We want to shape up EU's leading role in health worldwide against this very complex geopolitical landscape I was referring to earlier. The external dimension of our health policy has transitioned from useful to essential. It is a matter of well-being for all Europeans, but at the same time, it is also a key component of our economic competitiveness and our social cohesion and stability. And also it reinforces the weight and the brand name of the EU as a force of good, able to contribute to better health worldwide. The broad objectives of this strategy that I'm happy to present to you today and listen to your views later is, first of all, to regain the lost ground by going back to the fundamentals, reaching universal health coverage, strengthening primary health care, and investing in healthy lifestyles. All this will be at the core of our action, and all this will be the driver of our investment. We want to achieve this, as always, by fostering a Team Europe approach. When our Union acts as Team Europe, we are unbeatable. We will be seeking joint ownership and responsibility between Team Europe and our partners worldwide, and it is more than something that we want. It's something that we need to do if we are to have a meaningful global health strategy. Finally, thirdly, we need the right governance backdrop to all this. This will never work unless we have a sufficient governance architecture, a strong and accountable, first of all, multilateral system with the WHO at its core, but we also must harness the many actors and global initiatives available to support our priorities. These objectives, honourable members, as you can judge for yourselves, are of course important, are mutually dependent and mutually reinforcing. It's not something that will happen because we say or we decree from Brussels. These are the results of a genuinely comprehensive consultation process, which also covered all main stakeholders in the EU, but also abroad, with a particular emphasis on Global South. Together with the global strategy, on the 30th of November, we will also adopt and present the first annual State of Preparedness report prepared by our new valuable ally in fighting health threats, HERA. As public and political attention over preparedness somehow wanes, it is important that we keep it at the top of our political agenda. And the aim of this report would be precisely to contribute to the enforcement of the EU coordination and leadership in preparedness against health threats. HERA is operational for 1 year only, but this report is one of a series that will have a specific focus on the issues that we had in mind precisely when we created HERA. Medical countermeasures at EU level, the list of top 3 health threats that we identified in July 2020, how we fight, how we prepare on time before these threats hit us. And these threats, of course, are known to you, are the pathogens with high pandemic potential, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and antimicrobial resistance. These are the threats that our preparedness should plan against. It will also cover research, development, production, procurement, and distribution of such countermeasures. Just a word on research. I recognize that the EU has been lagging behind the US and China in R&D developments in health sector. But the crisis also acted as a catalyst, as an alarm, and we took actions precisely to address these shortcomings. These are now actions that will fall under the remit of HERA and other projects funded under our ambitious Horizon Europe program, which are undergoing and will help us bridge this gap against our competitors. And looking ahead, my ambition is that the next year's preparedness report will focus on broader health preparedness actions beyond what we're having this year, which is clearly focused on countermeasures. Dear friends, I want you to be reassured that both the Global Health Strategy and the first preparedness report will not constitute a one-off type of initiatives, something that will happen in a day and then will die peacefully somewhere at the lowest levels of our political agenda. Our intention, our firm intention, is to ensure monitoring and fostering the implementation of these initiatives. Let me conclude by saying that what I presented just now is the sketch and not the script of what we are aiming at. Preparations on both initiatives are reaching now cruising speed, and this is now the right time to fix the destination and the means to get there. And as I said at the beginning, together with this House, we are much stronger because we can jointly focus, building on the richness of our past exchanges, we can jointly focus on what matters most. And I very much look forward to your ideas, contributions, and remarks to shape these important documents and color them with your views, which you know are valued to us. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Vice President Schinas. And now we go to the political groups for their remarks and questions. I'm very happy that we have Mrs. Asimakopoulo here, replacing the coordinator of EPP. Please, you have the floor.
Yes, Madam Chair. I'm afraid my colleague Kibouropoulos was unable to make it today, but it is a fortuitous circumstance for myself to be before your committee, Madam Chair, and also to have listened to the presentation, the thorough presentation delivered by Vice President Commissioner Schinas. I think that it's very important that we acknowledge that the EU and the member states have played a very key role in what we call the global response to the pandemic. This, let us not forget, included the mobilization of more than 46 billion euros in order to address the health emergency, strengthen the health systems, and to ensure access to medical countermeasures in partner countries. I'm also happy to see that the Union is now at the forefront with your guidance of the discussions on improving multilateral cooperation and the international health infrastructure. Commissioner Schinas, you presented the global health strategy and its main orientations. My colleague, Mr. Kibouropoulos, had actually asked about its main pillars. I'm sure that he'll be covered by your presentation. Another question, though, and a topic that you didn't touch on as thoroughly and might be of interest, is to know where the negotiations are and what the key EU priorities are with respect to the pandemic treaty negotiations. So I would appreciate if in your second intervention you could shed some light on that. Thank you again for being here today in this exchange.
Thank you very much, Anna Michel, also for being here in our committee. I'm going to take the role, change my hat a little bit, because our coordinator will arrive a little too late, later in the afternoon. But as you know, it's something that interests me personally very much as well. First of all, the US, the National Institute of Health, which is the counterpart of HERA, well, the sort of comparable, and BARDA, but they have a budget of around about $40 billion a year. HERA, let's say 1.8 billion a year. And I know it's not that comparable, but because there's a pathway to go, but still the gap is huge. How do we think we can even try to match what the United States can do in times of a pandemic and that sort of urgencies? My second question, we had Seth Berkley here, I think a week ago, of Gavi, on the 13th of October, and he made the plea to have one big production facility in Africa. I tend to disagree. I think it is even saying that we have one production capacity in the whole of Europe, even with Ukraine included, not mentioning Russia. I don't know whether that is a solution. I think more regional, diverted production capacity is reasonable. But I want your views on that, because I think it's one of the key issues. Also for the future pandemics, how do we deal with local production capacity? My last is a more general question. I know you and the Commission took on a big consultation round with a lot of our partners in the Global South to prepare the strategy. What were the main takeaways for us? What were their requests towards us? And it's also important, relates to the question of Anna Michel with regard to the pandemic treaty, because it connects to each other. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. Let me start with Ms. Asimakopoulou. The work on the pandemic treaty is complex. It's not as simple as you can imagine. And I understand that the work is going on. We are fully involved. But a pandemic treaty has to strike very complex and moving issues, both with our international partners and the WHO. So it's not something that can be evaluated, I would say, in the short term. This is a process. It's something that should be the focus of our attention in the long run. The European Union will be part of it. It cannot be otherwise, since our role in pandemics management now has been reinforced. And I would say, malgré nous, sometimes we are now considered as a very central player in all this. So let me assure you that we will continue to be centrally involved in this ongoing work. Now, on the President's, on the Chair's remarks, on the budget, on HERA, yes, I think this is something that we discussed also at the College. Clearly, I think the comparison 40 to 1.5 does not honor the thinking behind HERA. I think that when it comes to the overall amount of EU resources that HERA will be able to mobilize, including from sources like structural funds, emergency budget, emergency money, and research money, not to mention money from our development aid portfolio and neighbourhood, I think I can reasonably repeat here what I said in the press conference the day we adopted HERA, that our ambition is that the total amount that HERA can rely on is 40 billion euros, which is a comparable figure to the United States. But, and this is probably my reply to a follow-up question on this, to be able to activate this order of money, HERA first must prove its worth, must show that they are able to function, must provide good supply of support, anticipation, countermeasures, should ring the bell at a very early stage, should tell us very authoritatively what we need. So I'm confident, Madam Chair, that when HERA goes from toddler age to teenage, all this would be done in a way that is to our satisfaction. Now on Africa, yes, we have been consulting, and this is something that also my colleague Jutta Urpilainen is doing in parallel with her interlocutors. I understand you have also invited Jutta to come, so she will give you a more direct input of these consultations. I want to be very clear, and probably I'm saying this with the benefit of someone who has a certain distance from the money of our development aid. This is an opportunity, a global health strategy. It is also an opportunity for Europe to be transparent to our partners in Africa. That this is what will guide our finding. So we will not, when it comes to health, we will, and probably that's a partial answer to your third question too, we will not be spraying money around. EU assistance should target very clearly defined health priorities. And this is the added value of the health strategy. It will focus, it will guide our spending. And we want our partners to know. So it is important that they get it before it happens. And I think that the initiatives, the priorities, our objectives, I think are, how should I put this, universally recognized in Africa as something that is clearly in their interest too. Now, on your question, Madam Chair, on the Africa vaccines, which we also have discussed repeatedly, if there is one thing also that the pandemic showed us is that geographical diversification of production capacities is a must. And you know, you were involved, many of you, that in May last year we launched this 1 billion Team Euro initiative precisely to step up vaccine manufacture in Africa. Succeeding is not only a question of money or infrastructure. The initiative has to support a 360-degree approach that would also tackle barriers, access to vaccines, storage, infrastructure networks, and local production. So I would agree with you that we need diversification, but we also need to address the globality of factors that impact on diversification. And now African-led projects are already advancing with substantial EU support in front-runner countries like Senegal, Rwanda, South Africa, and Ghana. And I very much hope that our strong partnerships with the African Union Commission, the Africa Center for the African CDC, and the African Union Development Policy Agency, these are agencies that are monitoring ours. I think that we are now creating a new ecosystem in Africa on health, which will serve us both, Europeans and Africans alike.
Okay, thank you very much. Looking forward to the 40 billion of HERA. Mrs. Trilena-Noire.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Vice President Margaritis. I have some focused questions to ask you about the last presentation of the European Court of Auditors vaccine procurement process. In its conclusions, the court identifies several weaknesses and calls the European institutions and agencies to draw several lessons. We have met them, it was clear. I would like to know how you intend to take measures in order to answer their own questions on the revision of the sharing of responsibilities between member states and manufacturers when it comes to secondary effects, priority access to European territory, access clause, solidarity stockpiling for low and middle income countries, although you have already answered the point, more flexibility from the manufacturers in order to avoid overstocking and waste of a large number of medicines, and of course, last but not least, guarantee more transparency in the negotiation and conclusion of joint purchase contracts. Thank you for all information and for your answers.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Rivasi.
Merci Madame la Présidente et merci Monsieur Schinas d'être là. Moi je suis désolée qu'il n'y ait pas la traduction en français entre nous, mais enfin bon. Passons. Eh oui, mais c'est pas normal. Bon. Alors, au début de la pandémie, l'Union européenne et ses dirigeants ont pris un engagement public qui était bien sûr de promouvoir les vaccins contre le Covid, mais de dire surtout, ça doit être considéré comme des biens publics mondiaux. Et même notre présidente disait, aucun d'entre nous ne sera en sécurité tant que tout le monde ne sera pas en sécurité. Ça, c'était la présidente de la Commission européenne. Il y a eu un accord conclu entre la Commission et les États membres, et il était dit qu'il fallait que la Commission cherche à promouvoir, je vous lis tel que c'est mis, des questions connexes avec l'industrie pharmaceutique en matière de partage de la propriété intellectuelle, en particulier lorsqu'une telle propriété intellectuelle a été développée avec le soutien de financements publics. Et c'était le cas, notamment au niveau des ARN messagers. Bon. Monsieur Schinas, nous avons auditionné des hauts responsables des entreprises pharma qui nous ont tous confirmé que la Commission n'avait absolument pas mis à table, au niveau des négociations, le fait du partage de la propriété intellectuelle. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous expliquer pourquoi la Commission n'a pas au moins essayé de remplir ce mandat? Deuxième chose, pourquoi, quand l'Afrique du Sud et l'Inde avaient demandé la dérogation des accords TRIPS, c'est-à-dire la levée des brevets sur les technologies du Covid, une fois que l'inégalité vaccinale entre les pays riches et les pays pauvres était devenue tellement forte que d'ailleurs le directeur de l'OMS avait parlé d'apartheid vaccinal. Pourquoi là? Eh bien, la Commission a bloqué. Parce que vous voyez, il y a quand même une contradiction. On ne peut pas parler de biens publics, on ne le met pas sur le mandat avec les labos, et après, au niveau de l'OMC, qui bloque la Commission européenne pour la levée des brevets? Alors c'est l'incohérence la plus totale. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous apporter des précisions? Merci.
Merci beaucoup. And Mrs. Anderson.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to comment on the question earlier I raised. Madam Chair, when I asked you why you didn't announce the decision as to why, or the lacking majority, why Mr. Ursula von der Leyen is not going to be invited into this committee, you answered because there was no decision taken. Well, when there was a proposal to invite Ursula von der Leyen in the coordinators meeting, and it was put to a vote, and it didn't find a majority. So the decision that was taken by the coordinators was not to invite Ursula von der Leyen. I think you should have announced it, but since you didn't, I'll let it slide.
I didn't see you in the coordinators meeting, Mrs. Anderson, so I don't think it's up to you to make the conclusions. Can you please raise the question to Mr. Schinas?
I just said I'll let it go because I will continue with my time now. I just wanted to clarify, decision taken is decision taken. Anyways, thank you so much for being here. According to your answers, Mr. Schinas, to EU Parliament before you were appointed to the EU Commission, I could read you strongly believe in accountability, and you were always very conscious of taxpayers' money. Now, Ursula von der Leyen is suspected to have circumvented proper procedure when negotiating mRNA injection contracts. She refuses to disclose text messages exchanged between her and CEO Pfizer Bourla, and she may very well have squandered billions of taxpayers' money. Will you stand by your strong belief in accountability, and will you recommend to Ursula von der Leyen to appear in this committee and to answer the people's questions? And I would further more like to know, what are your thoughts on Ursula von der Leyen's behavior, which I, quite frankly, find to be a reflection of her contempt for the people? Thank you.
Just to clarify, also for all the other members that were not in the coordinators meeting, we took a decision to ask for the documents that were mentioned in the ECA report, and to write a letter to Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen. Well, I write a letter to Mrs. Metsola, to write a letter to Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, and we did not take a decision whether or not to invite her, because we will take that up at a later stage. And I think even if we want to invite her, it's better to do that at a later stage. And that was what the majority in the coordinators decided.
Thank you so much. So noted.
Thank you. Mr. Schinas.
Thank you. Thank you for these questions. Let's take them by order. Mrs. Trainer-Noir raises, of course, the issue of liability, which we have discussed many times in the past. I think that the Commission emphasizes that our approach to third-party liability and indemnification, compensation ensured the rights of our citizens, and that we also made clear that legal liability stays with pharmaceutical companies in all cases. However, due to the specificity of the pandemic conditions, Member States accepted to share some of the financial risks taken by the companies. And we have noted that the European Court of Auditors points to a different approach in the US Preparedness Act that totally shields the pharmaceutical companies from litigation. In a joint meeting recently on the 13th of October, the member of the Court of Auditors confirmed and welcomed that the Commission has not compromised on the protection of citizens' rights and has always ensured that the provisions of the Product Safety Directive are respected. Now, on your basic, I would say, broader question of vaccines procurement, and probably you would allow me, Chair, this is a more political statement. I am fully convinced that this has been a small European miracle, or a great European success story, if you like. One that probably has not been analysed enough, one that has not been defended enough, but one that has been felt as such by Europeans. And I think, at least I speak for myself and the Commission and my colleagues that this is not a small thing for a European Union to achieve under a constitutional and legal environment which is known on health policy. Under these circumstances, the European Union designed, implemented the biggest program of vaccination in the history of mankind. And we were able to deliver for all Europeans, regardless of their place of residence or socioeconomic condition. And I think this is something, this European success story is something that we should collectively be aware of when we discuss these issues. Madame Rivasi mentions also, we have discussed many times in the contact group, the issue of intellectual property. You know, I think I have explained that as well at the time, that the European Union has always been central in the discussions on a WTO response to the pandemic from the start. In June last year, also as a result of our exchanges in the contact group, we have put forward in the WTO a comprehensive approach in relation to trade and health, which included elements such as trade facilitating measures, improved transparency, restraint from export restrictions. And for the Commission, I think it is very clear that we do believe that intellectual property is part of the solution as regards access to vaccines, because of the role it plays as an incentive for innovation and development of new vaccine, but also as a way of helping developing countries. And let us not forget, when it comes to the global European response, that the European Union, by far, is the world champion of exports of vaccines. We exported 2.55 billion doses of vaccines. Nobody else
Sorry, Mr. Schinas, this is not the question, that.
I haven't concluded my answer. I'm still in the middle of my reply. Je suis en train d'évolution. J'ai encore des choses à dire. So, I was saying that one should not forget that the issue of intellectual property is part of a whole galaxy of measures that the European Union did activate and still activate to lead the global response. And we did that not only with the exports, the number of 2.55 billion export vaccines from Europe, it's also a number that should make us proud. And I haven't seen that number circulating enough in the European public space. I have seen the arguments pointing to the contrary, but I haven't seen anyone saying that we exported 2.55 billion to the world. On Africa, we were also key in the COVAX facility. Through COVAX, we helped to deliver 1.7 doses through COVAX to 146 countries, Africa and beyond. And this is probably the last thing I would like to reply to Madame Rivasi, is that we are happy and satisfied that the mechanism that it was finally agreed at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference in June this year backs and clarifies the already existing legal framework of the WTO, the TRIPS agreement, with the objective to ensure a fair and broad access to vaccines. On Mrs. Anderson, yes, I stand by all pledges that I made in my hearing in the European Parliament. I assumed it with a certain pride and satisfaction. I also hold the Commission record for the longest parliamentary hearing in EU history. Mine lasted for 3 hours and a half. I remember very well what I said, and yes, I did say that we will prioritize all issues of transparency to this House and the respect of taxpayers' money. You are asking me on a number of transmission of confidential information to this House, which is being done under the very specific provisions of the Framework Agreement for transmitting this kind of information to this Parliament. I stand by this process. I will do everything in my powers to make sure that this House benefits from the biggest number of information and data. On the specific question concerning the President, of course, the President, when she comes, will explain her way of seeing this, but I can tell you that nobody can negotiate the complexity of these contracts by SMS or alone. This was a procedure that was very well structured, Commission, Member States, a steering committee, rounds and rounds of negotiation, back to the Member States, back to the steering committee. So the idea of someone alone improvised with a telephone, the complexity of these negotiations, I think, would have to be seen in the light of the very specific institutional and organizational arrangements that we set in place and which I'm sure my colleague Stella Kyriakidis had a chance to explain to your committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President of the Commission. That's why it is very important that we do get access to these documents, as we have requested them. Mr. Teres.
Thank you so much. Safe and effective. This is what we were told by the European Commission in many hearings, as in the plenary of the European Parliament, to pass the digital green certificate because people will be safe and the transmission of the virus will be stopped. We find out now, after a year and a half, that all of that information was false, because these injections are not stopping the transmission of the virus, as the Pfizer representative acknowledged, and as Pfizer acknowledged in multiple answers to the media, and as the representative of the European Commission acknowledged in this committee on October the 13th. So the first question that I have to is the following. According to the report from the Court of Auditors, the European Commission, under the leadership of Ursula von der Leyen, purchased 4.6 billion doses of vaccines for 71 billion euros. So if these injections were effective, why she purchased that many doses of vaccines? In other words, 10 doses of vaccines for every human being living in the EU. Second question is about transparency. The issue of contracts. You were mentioning the issue of liabilities and indemnity, and these companies might be liable for some of the side effects. When are you going to fully publish these contracts? Because you guys talk about them, but we haven't seen them. Nobody in the Parliament saw the full version of these contracts, and I think for the people it's important that at least someone else besides you guys from the Commission have access to these contracts. Final question. What do you have to say to people who trusted the statement made by the European Commission and by Ursula von der Leyen that these vaccines are safe and now they have severe adverse effects? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Montserrat.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Muchísimas gracias, vicepresidente. La pandemia del COVID-19 ha demostrado que ningún país puede enfrentar y solucionar emergencias globales por sí solo. La salud se ha convertido en una cuestión geopolítica, sobre todo por la relación que existe entre la salud y la seguridad. Por eso la dimensión internacional de la política sanitaria de la UE se ha convertido en una parte crucial de la acción exterior de la UE. Además de afrontar mejor las emergencias, la pandemia ha puesto de manifiesto deficiencias y problemas estructurales, entre otros, en las capacidades de producción de medicamentos y vacunas de muchos países socios de la UE. Yo misma soy la rapporteur de este informe y me preocupan dos cosas. Y yo quiero mirar hacia el futuro, ¿no? ¿Cómo podemos mejorar? Lo primero es que creo sinceramente que hemos sido lentos en facilitar la investigación y la producción en la Unión Europea. Esa estrategia de reindustrialización, de reindustrialización, ¿no?, de nuestro continente. Tenemos mucha industria europea o como mínimo mucha industria made in Europe que tendríamos que ayudarles a facilitar, menos burocracia, con más seguridad, a producir, invertir, investigar en Europa, porque esta será nuestra gran bandera en eso de salud y seguridad. Y el segundo punto, para mí muy importante, es ciberataques. Tenemos que ser conscientes que últimamente están habiendo muchos ciberataques a nuestros hospitales. Hace 2 semanas, en un solo día, atacaron a 3 hospitales, por ejemplo, en mi ciudad, en Barcelona, y en el último año y medio en España hemos sufrido, por ejemplo, 3.000 ciberataques en hospitales y en infraestructuras sanitarias. Tenemos que trabajar en la seguridad y luchar contra los ciberataques, pero no ciberataques individuales. Nos hemos pensado, porque cualquier emergencia sanitaria es también una guerra biológica, también ataques a nuestros dispositivos, nuestros satélites europeos, por ejemplo, que eso perjudicaría muchísimo al día a día de nuestros pacientes y ciudadanos. Por tanto, quiero relacionar salud y seguridad. No tendremos salud y seguridad si no tenemos en Europa investigación, inversión y producción, y a la vez no tendremos salud ni seguridad si no tenemos realmente una pantalla de seguridad ante cualquier tipo de ataque y de defensa ante emergencias también de guerras biológicas. Por lo tanto, estas son mis 2 preguntas, ¿no?, de cómo se está preparando la Comisión ante estos grandes desafíos. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gluck.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Commission Vice President. Your job is to ensure the European way of life. And for me, this includes both. Like, on one hand, common procurement and how we can make a good deal as European Union, on one hand. And on the other hand, to ensure transparency, to allow us as a parliament to scrutinize the work the Commission has done. And I believe this needs certain rules, because for the future we have to go for a lot of common procurements. I'm convinced of that. The problem is that both goals, common procurement and good deals, and to ensure transparency, sometimes is contradictory. Because manufacturers, for example, don't want to publish the price the European Union wants to pay or has to pay for a dose of vaccines, for example. And, on one hand, I can understand the position of the Parliament, of us members of Parliament. On the other hand, I can some sort of understand why the manufacturers don't want to publish these figures, because otherwise somebody else would come and say, hey, my deal has to be at least as good as the deal of the European Union. And for future procurements, we have to work on certain rules. We can tackle all those questions, like on IP rights, we have been the bottlenecks and so on, but also the price transparency. And so I was thinking about that. What do you think about my idea that in the current situation of common procurement, it is okay maybe not to publish the price immediately, but after, maybe let's talk about it, maybe after half a year or a year, the price has to be published so that we as members of Parliament can scrutinize the work the Commission has done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and give the floor to Mrs. Paulus. And then you can answer the questions. Fine, that's the last question.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for being here. And my question goes again to the global health strategy, because I believe that the EU should take a very prominent role on negotiating this health strategy, and also taking into account that, as you said, we are one of the largest exporter economic blocks, which is of course due to the fact that we have a lot of production capacity. So related to our production capacity, it might look differently, but I don't have the numbers on that. But how do you see the EU's role when it comes to a fair distribution of vaccines, not only for COVID, of course, but also for other health threats? And second question, in the global health strategy, we should also look at prevention of pandemics, because vaccines are great when you already have the threat imminent, but how would we prevent pandemics to come upon us? And therefore, I would like to hear your view on the IPBES workshop report that we might be on the threshold of entering the age of pandemics due to the destruction of wilderness and putting ever more pressure, because there we have a lot of zoonotic diseases which are just waiting to spread over to humans. And I would like to know, how do you plan to implement the One Health approach into the global health strategy? Thank you.
I'd love to give you the floor, Mrs. But I don't have any time for Catch the Eye. In the next round, we have an hour and a half, and I have to, for the final answers, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for the richness of this debate and the quality contributions. I really appreciate this exchange, and I want to assure you once again that your concerns and your views will be reflected not only in the two specific initiatives that we're preparing for the 30th of November, but also in the planning and design of our EU Health Union. I was a COVID patient a couple of months before the vaccines were authorized. I spent a week in hospital. I was taken away from home in an ambulance, surrounded by astronauts type looking auxiliary staff. I lost conscience for a couple of days. And the only thing that kept me hopeful was that the vaccines are approaching. And since then, no severe cases have, at least for people of my age group, have been detected precisely because the vaccines were meant to be not a barrier also against transmission, but also a barrier against serious illness, against hospitalization, and vaccines are safe, are efficient, and are working. And those who would like to isolate this discussion only in terms of transmission, I think are missing the overall point, and the fact that our health systems in the European Union are now able to cope. It's also as a result of our capacity to develop vaccines and therapeutics for the population at large. Your second question is, why did we order so many? Can I take you back to the pre-vaccine era of Europe? We were on a global, total confinement. We had 400 million confined in their homes. We had paralyzed social and economic life. And we were expecting the vaccines to be able to take our lives back. And how many vaccines do you order in this political situation? How many of the 400 million confined Europeans can be left out of the vaccination program? How many would you order?
Well, clearly not yet.
Well, I think yes, I think I shouldn't ask. I apologize. But what I'm trying to tell you in goodwill is precisely that we ordered so many because we were very clear in discussions with our member states and the people who were in the know, our epidemiological advisors, and they were from the very early stage, pushing us for a global, universal coverage. And even when vaccines were authorized and started coming out, then we were also under pressure that it was not enough and it was not too fast. So one day I think the history of how this program evolved will be written, but I can assure you that this question of universal coverage was not a caprice, was not something that someone thought of like that, but it was the result of very sustained organic discussions with our epidemiological advisors and our member states. On the contracts, I think I have already replied. I fully agree that the Parliament has to be given access to the transparency, according to the access to the framework agreement on the transmission of confidential information, of course, preserving the commercial element of many of these contracts, although I must say that the European Court of Auditors has the possibility and the obligation to audit fully these contracts, and the new president has publicly stated that he had in his possession everything that he needed to ensure a full audit, which I'm sure will also be shared with the Parliament. Now, on Mrs. Montserrat's question, I think she very rightly points to an issue which I like to call resilience. As a result of what happened to us, one of the main reasons is how we build resilience. It took us a pandemic to realize that we do not manufacture masks, ventilators in the European Union, that our raw materials for the pharmaceutical industry are made in India or in China. And this call for resilience, this is the term I prefer to use instead, the strategic autonomy. The resilience of our system is something that we need. That's why we built HERA. That's why we built a manufacturing capacity. That's why we are reviewing our pharmaceutical legislation. On the specific issue of cyber threat, cyber attacks, you are very right in pointing it out as a new problem for health, because the hackers, the cyber criminals, are now targeting our health systems as a priority for one very simple reason, because there is an enormous amount of data being easily located into our health systems, and the banking sector and the financial services are becoming better and better in defending themselves, whereas our national health systems do not consider this part of their job as core duty. So now they're building their buffers. So we are working now together with the Parliament and the Council to build this Cybersecurity Act. We have a fantastic agreement thanks to the work of this Parliament, but also to the French presidency on the Network Information System 2, NIS 2 directive that builds additional coverage for cybersecurity. And I'm confident that by building these blocks of resilience, we will complement our health policy beyond the traditional remit of pharmaceuticals, vaccines, and therapeutics. Now, on the question of later access to the price, I think the question is not that much a question of timing, but it's also a question of confidentiality of commercial information. This is the heart of the matter. Why? Because you said it yourself. Because these are companies, and we manage taxpayers' money. We have a stake, an interest, not to let everybody know how much we are willing to pay, because that automatically sets a market of expectations, a threshold of expectations that in the long run goes against the proper use of public taxpayers' money. So it has to be very careful to consider, to gauge what would be the best political moment for full transparency. But this does not preclude from the European Court of Auditors, which is our auditing house, to have everything they need to ensure that your fears, in a way, or doubts are addressed. So we have to establish this equilibrium. Finally, on the question on the overall role of Europe in the global health policy, I think you are right when you say that this will not be the result of one single intervention. It's not, and I have the fullest of respect of those who say that vaccines diplomacy would be key. It's important, but not key. It does not work with an image of Europe that is signing a check or providing a box or showing our flag. It has to be seen as an ecosystem of a Europe of health that is at the heart of the global response. And this is, I think, something, I repeat what I said earlier, that more and more people say. Talk to the Director General of the WHO, who is not European. He would tell you, Europe honored, the European Union honored Europe by what you did. So we are being perceived now as this global player of good, but we need to be able to do it intelligently, addressing different subjects. And that's precisely the added value of the global health strategy. Not one, but all the issues that have a relevance to our positioning in the world of ensuring global health policy. And I would be delighted, Madam Chair, if you would invite us, together with High Representative Vice President Josep Borrell or with Jutta, to come again and present after the 30th of November both the first preparedness report and the global health strategy. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Schinas, for being here, taking the time, openly answer all these questions. And I think, as I said, on transparency, both of the documents and on pricing, different issues, but it's important that these documents, that we can receive them. I agree, I have to say, with the fact that Europe did an amazing thing in authorizing purchasing and ramping up production of the vaccines, but it is also important that we have full clarity on all these issues that I think is the right of the European Parliament representing the people. On the pricing, I think we will have difficult discussions also amongst the political groups how to look at these issues on the future, but that there is a need of transparency over there as well. I think you can recognise that also in the questions that you see here. Looking very much forward to the global health strategy, and we'll see how we organise ourselves to get into that as well. And in any case, we'll take it on board in the report. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Okay, dear colleagues, let's go to point 5, to our next hearing, and that is a hearing with Dr. Ciro Ugarte of the Pan-American Health Organization, PAHO, and Dr. Suerie Moon, co-director Global Health Center, Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. Very happy to have them both online, and I hope that is all working fine. Dear Dr. Ugarte, we will start the discussion with you. Thank you very much for taking the time. We have invited PAHO because you have an extremely interesting story to tell. PAHO has a long history of supporting epidemic surveillance and vaccination strategy in the Americas. And you had your boots on the ground during the COVID pandemic. And we all remember the images of local villages in Brazil being devastated by one of the variants, killing thousands of indigenous people. For many countries in Latin America, COVAX was too little, too late. And I want to hear about your lessons learned from the pandemic and your recommendations for the future. So let me start with you, Dr. Ugarte, and give you the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is an honor for me to participate in this meeting. The European Parliament is a body that embeds all the discussions that must be applied by the member states. And this is particularly the Special Committee on COVID-19 pandemic on the lessons learned and recommendations for the future perspectives is something that we value a lot. And I would like to begin my intervention with some words of what we have achieved during this period. First, there was a long history of the world dealing with this type of emergencies, but this pandemic happened almost 100 years after the previous devastating pandemic, flu pandemic. So the countries received a formal alert in the world, but particularly in the region, very early in the process. Once Wuhan declared that they were having more than 30 million people, not moving from the places, it was an alarm that prompted the activation of the incident management system PAHO level, but also at the Pan American Health Organization, but also the World Health Organization. And there was a direct coordination inside the organization with the member states, with all the foreign affairs delegations, but also with the ministries of health and key actors inside the countries. There was also a consolidation of the interprogrammatic work. So we learned from many large emergencies that this is not just a health sector response, but this is beyond the health sector. Actually, when we look at the health aspects of the pandemic, we may see that the emergency happened first at the economic, social, and political levels before the health services were overwhelmed by patients. So there was also a need to adjust the cooperation lines. Many countries that used to provide technical cooperation and even supporting other countries in many aspects, and you mentioned Brazil, but we can mention several other big countries in the Americas, they were also subject of receiving support from many other countries, in particular with some key aspects of the availability of supplies that were hugely scarce. As you know, the global supply chain collapsed very early in the process. So we believe that there were some missed opportunities. One of the biggest missed opportunities is that each country had an individual response without a regional vision and even the world vision. Of course, every leader of a country must take care of their population, of their own population. That is clear, and that will happen all the time. But having said that, one way is to protect their own communities and being protected from the rest, and maybe take decisions that will affect all the others, and the contrary may increase the insecurity for their own countries. For example, if they do not exchange information because of the possible economic impact of accepting that you have the first case of COVID-19 or the first death, or you are overwhelmed, etc. But the other part is, as you very well know, the bilateral agreements with the biggest companies and producers for the procurement of PPEs, equipment, vaccines, and others, that also caused a huge impact in the countries that could not do that because of lack of funding, but also because many of those countries were looking at the international community, particularly to WHO, PAHO, the United Nations, and others, to help them to receive vaccines or other supplies. Unfortunately, that was not the case in the first part of the pandemic. There was also, in some areas, in some countries, an excessive interference of politics in the decision-making processes. So the recommendations to apply public health measures and other measures, including, for example, do not impact the trade or travels or the production and share of supplies and critical supplies among countries, was heavily affected by the interference of a political decision. We need political decision. We live in a political decision all the time, but having an excessive interference beyond what is the evidence also caused a lot of havoc in many countries. The other part is that it also provided, because of this lack of supplies and also the urgency to do something and at any cost, there was a big space for corruption. And unfortunately, that corruption was also fueled by the industry that, of course, wanted to have a higher revenue in that regards. And there are many people that also became very rich during the pandemic while others were dying or losing all their assets. I recall, for example, that in Peru, to look for oxygen, for example, you had to pay a lot of money, just oxygen. And you have even to sell all your belongings, your properties. And if the people that were poor, the indigenous populations or the migrants, for example, were the ones that were even more affected because they didn't have all the means to do that. But also there was the internal bureaucratic processes not adapted for the emergency. So the decision-making process not always was straightforward, but was happening too late, and unfortunately those decisions were not implemented at full spectrum. And the decisions most of the time were not linked to evidence. Why? Because of course there was a lot of uncertainty. How this disease is transmitted, how this disease can be treated, how this disease can be stopped. All those things were uncertainties, and those type of uncertainties will happen every time that there is a new pathogen that is affected the human health. So in that regard, it is a matter of taking all the decisions based on the lessons learned of previous emergencies, but also on some other factors that we know that works well. So in that regard, we are looking at in this process, looking at the pandemic, and now in this situation today, we're looking to accelerate the health agenda in the world for a safer world, but also to learn from this pandemic. But learning means that we have to do a proper assessment, a transparent and open assessment. All the assessments that have been done today are done by international bodies, independent panels and others. But as we discussed with the ministries of health and the countries themselves and the ones that were taking the decision, very few of them were interviewed. And not one country had the time or the willingness to do a proper lessons learned with all the actors, the opposition, the ones that were making the decisions at all the levels, the federal level, the national level, subnational level, and also the local level, and also, of course, with the patients. With the patients, the ones that were receiving those support or not receiving the support. And the resilience of the health sector is something that we need to build. But now, after the pandemic has lasted more than 2 years, we are forgetting that the resilient health systems is a core part of this accelerating the health agenda. And most of it is going to expanding the health services, in all areas. As you know very well, we need to identify the priority areas where we together may be safer. So we need to invest in the international health regulations, and actually the only article that, in my opinion, is needed, just one line that says, comply with the international health regulations. If the countries would comply with the national health regulation, we won't need any other instrument. But unfortunately, there are no sanctions for the countries that do not apply or comply with the international health regulations. So it is a matter of amending that part and having, of course, the accountability at the global, at the highest level, to advance the global health governance, but also to work on the recovery of negotiation and regional positions in every area of the world. But building on achievements during the pandemic is also something that need to be done. So in that regards, we in the world, we are together, we are interconnected, but some of the countries are not at the level that they the next pandemic will be successful, or response for the next pandemic will be successful for them. And this is a long work that we need to do, but particularly solidarity of the European Union with the Americas, both in technical support, scientific support, financial support, and this relation that we have for many decades, because we do have territories, overseas territories, but also the culture of many of our countries are looking to Europe to see what's happening, what is being done properly, and to apply in the Americas. But of course, working together, maybe we'll have our two regions safer. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ugarte, for these introductory remarks. Very interesting. Move now to Professor Moon. Professor Moon, you are a specialist in global health matters in Geneva, and we invited you to bring insights in what currently lives in the Geneva health bubble and to bring an academic perspective to the table. I'm sure it is interesting to touch upon topics like the vaccine nationalism, COVAX, and the future of regional manufacturing. And we also discussed the pandemic treaty with Ronald Ries 2 weeks ago. Perhaps you could give us your perspective on that discussion as well. Professor Moon, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and the honourable members of the European Parliament for the invitation and the opportunity to be here with you. It's certainly a big honour for me. What I'd like to do indeed is to focus my remarks on the issue of research and development and access to medicines, including vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics, and what the experience of COVID-19, in fact, tells us about what the global health architecture should look like in the future. I've prepared a few slides for my opening remarks. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do is to just leave you with 3 key points as a way of kicking off the discussion. And my first point is that we need more effective, in order to have a more effective and equitable response to future health emergencies, we need at the regional level to have research and development capacity, production capacity, and procurement capacity. And this is something that I think has been widely recognized. We see this in current efforts, for example, to expand production capacity in different parts of the world. We've seen this in the recent external evaluation of the ACT Accelerator that was published just 2 weeks ago. And we hear this very frequently in my discussions with various governments, particularly those from low and middle income countries. What I hear very often is a very strong desire to have much more control and ownership and ability to, in fact, influence the extent to which one's own country is able to access vaccines and other important technologies in the event of a future crisis. During the COVID-19 crisis, we had what I would call a much more centralized approach. It was a globalized and top-down approach. And what we've heard from many governments, as I was just saying, is that they would like to indeed rely less on Geneva, actually, and have more control in their own hands. I think for this, it's important to have not only production capacity, but also research and development, which is a theme I will return to in a few moments. Next slide, please. Before diving in, I think it's useful just to spend a couple of minutes on looking at how research and development of pandemic technologies is different from normal times or non-pandemic health technologies. And what you can see in this slide is in the middle, kind of the standard research and development process with a very central role played by the private sector. But of course, public money on the left-hand side, you can see providing the long-term investment that allows for the scientific basis on which technologies are developed. And also in the earlier stages of R&D, public money is very important, usually in the form of grants and loans to actually get many research and development processes going. Next slide, please. This is quite different, however, when we look at pandemic health technologies. And what I will note is, of course, you still have a very important role played by the private sector in the middle. You still have an important role for public long-term investment. But if you look at the top of the circle, public research and development grants and loans now extend much further throughout the process and really accompany the R&D process all the way through to production and reaching people. And what you saw in COVID-19 was a much more proactive role of the public sector in providing technical support to private firms, in providing regulatory advice, for example, in coordinating and in matchmaking, and essentially not waiting for the market to produce good outcomes for public health. We also had, you can see on the right-hand side of this circle, a very important role of public advance purchase agreements, and of course Europe was very important in this regard. For COVID-19 in particular, we had an estimated $6 billion of push funding upfront funding for R&D and about $50 billion of pull funding or advanced purchase commitments before regulatory approval. So this is at risk, $50 billion that was put on the table at risk in order to give companies comfort and confidence that they could scale up their manufacturing. And what you can see overall here is that for pandemic technologies, government and the public sector plays a much more central and essential and leading role than for, let's say, normal or non-pandemic health technologies. And this raises both the possibility that governments can do much more to make those technologies accessible worldwide, and also that governments, of course, need to craft the international rules to cooperate with each other in order to make this happen in a way that every country in the world can access the technologies that it needs. One of the reasons this is also very important. Let me actually come back to that in a second. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. What I wanted to flag here is that the European Union has been the single largest investor if we look at both push and pull funding into COVID-19 vaccine R&D. But without conditions on that funding to ensure the technology is shared, this contributes actually to unnecessary scarcity and, of course, the unequal and inequitable access to vaccines that we saw during this pandemic. What we also hear, though, is that for many regions of the world, they would like to mimic the success of Europe. We were hearing just a few minutes ago from the European Commission. And indeed, as a region, Europe was very, very successful in, of course, securing enough vaccines for every citizen within the region. And I think there are other regions of the world who would actually like to be able to do the same. So how do we get there? Next slide, please. One key in getting there is actually to not think about research and development as separate from access, but actually that we have to build global access into R&D and to do that as early as possible. Once the money has been spent or given to private firms, it's actually too late at that point to then ask firms to turn around and to ensure globally equitable access to their products. However, it is possible with intention and with foresight to actually make access part of the R&D process from the beginning. I'd like to offer you a very concrete example of that. Next slide, please. So a concrete example is the vaccine candidate that was initially developed at the Baylor College of Medicine in Texas in the United States. The platform that was the foundation for this vaccine was developed with U.S. public funding from the National Institutes of Health, initially for SARS and MERS. It was developed by a nonprofit academic PDP, or a product development partnership. And when COVID began, they received funding again from the US NIH and philanthropic funding, so public and philanthropic funding, to develop this vaccine candidate. They then licensed this vaccine candidate to Biological E, which is an Indian vaccine firm. And that firm in India was the one that actually carried out all of the development, the phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, obtaining regulatory approval all the way through to production. And they obtained approval in December of 2021. About 70 million people have since been vaccinated in India with this vaccine. And what's important to note is that the price was considered affordable by the Indian government. The private sector price is now about €3 per dose. There were no patents. There were no monopolies on this vaccine. And Baylor has since licensed this vaccine to Indonesia and Botswana as well. So I think this is a useful example of how you can build access considerations into research and development from the beginning to avoid some of the scarcity that we have seen during this pandemic. Next slide, please. Let me come now to my third key point, which is that no single country can actually do research, development, production, and ensure access to countermeasures on its own, not even the biggest and wealthiest countries in the world. All of this requires international cooperation, and the Pandemic Treaty offers a very important opportunity to get that international cooperation right. And again, I would like to emphasize this cooperation is very important, not just on procurement and access, but even more so at the research and development phase. Next slide. So one way in which international cooperation could be structured and has been structured is the way you see it on the screen. You have a number of governments. They put their money together through some kind of international fund, and you could put conditions on that funding that any private firm that receives that money will share data, technology, intellectual property, price at a fair level, and ensure global supply for any of the vaccines that may result. And in some ways, I would say partially CEPI has, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations has operated in this way. Next slide, please. But of course, we don't have just one international fund. We have a number of different players and a number of different R&D efforts around the world. The United States, starting the lower left-hand corner, has its own very large, very highly developed biosecurity R&D system. The European Union, having just created HERA on the US model in many ways, will have a much more developed system, I'm sure, quite soon. And this does raise some questions, of course, on what will the policies of HERA actually look like. You have CEPI, and then you have a number of regions of the world where, as I mentioned before, there is a very, very strong desire today to have more autonomy and control at the regional or national level, whether this is Latin America, Africa, of course, China and India, both vaccine powerhouses today, or Southeast Asia. This raises a risk that you could actually have competition between all of these hubs. For raw materials, for example, you could have competition and a race to develop the first products in the event of another health emergency. What we would rather have is, of course, collaboration and coordination between all of these different entities and an agreement on a common set of rules so that all countries are better off. All countries have greater health security. And what might those rules look like? You can imagine in the context of a pandemic treaty that there would be agreement, for example, on rules among all of these entities to share data with each other, to share technology with each other. If one region is first to develop a technology or develops a faster, a better technology, we would want that intellectual property to be available for everybody. And of course, also agreements on pricing, supply, and allocation. And we have an important opportunity to fix what has been, as Dr. Ugarte was just saying, a every country for itself, chaotic system that left everybody else worse off. Next slide. You do have precedents for these types of agreements in treaties in a number of other areas, such as in security, research, and in the environment. Next slide, please. And so what I'd like to leave you with is, again, a reiteration of three key points, that in order to have a better response in the future, we have to strengthen regional R&D production and procurement capacity. We have to build access into R&D as early as possible, and that we have the opportunity to strengthen international arrangements to do this by getting the rules right at the international level. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moon. Professor Moon, thank you very much for that very well-structured insight. If I was Roland Thriesen, I would ask you in my negotiating team, but yeah, we'll see. I'll give that as some sort of advice. Let's go to the discussion. First, Mrs. Montserrat, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the questions in Spanish. Well, después de haber escuchado la primera intervención, y como estamos aquí pues para estar preparados para el futuro, o sea, para examinar qué es lo que hemos hecho, bien, mal, mejorable, y cómo tenemos que mejorar para el futuro, sí que me gustaría preguntar al primer interviniente ¿qué deberíamos mejorar desde Europa en la transferencia de conocimiento, innovación, recursos humanos para poder pues, producir en países terceros, en su caso, en su región? Dos, ¿cómo nosotros podríamos ayudar para ayudar a ustedes a mejorar en la logística una vez llegan pues, nuestras vacunas desde el continente europeo? Tres, ¿cómo mejorar, ya esto quizás no es más competencia suya, pero cómo mejorar todo lo que nos ha explicado para luchar contra la corrupción? Y porque yo creo que son ¿no? tres ejes que usted nos ha dejado encima de la mesa muy importantes. Lo primero es ¿no? producción europea, exportación hacia su región. Dos, cómo mejorar la logística ya dentro de su región para el acceso más rápido e inmediato en su región. Y tres, luchar contra la corrupción. Y también quizás una cuarta pregunta es que le quiero dejar encima de la mesa es, en su región vimos al inicio de la pandemia, al inicio de que teníamos ya vacunas, que hubo muchos países iberoamericanos que optaron por la vacuna china, rusa y quizás no por la europea. Si conocen los motivos, el por qué no optaron por la vacuna europea y esto sí que me gustaría saberlo. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. For the S&D, I will raise the questions. First, to Dr. Ugarte, two questions. The first is on the COVAX decision to equally distribute vaccines with the value of 20% of the population. Would you regard? How do you look at it? Would you regard that as a good way of distributing, and how did that work for the Americas? What you said about the international health regulation intrigued me. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What were the main elements in the international health regulations that were not complied by? Can you maybe give examples? And maybe it's too delicate, but can you outline in your area of competence as PAHO which countries were the ones that could not comply? And how would you? It's always very difficult to get an international treaty and sanctions. How would you look at that? And you said also that you don't need anything else but the international health regulation. Does that mean that you're not very supportive of the negotiations on the pandemic treaty? Dr. Moon, Professor Moon, in the same direction, how would you look at sanctions in both international health regulation and the pandemic treaty? And what you said about the pandemic treaty is really very interesting. That's why I said you should be part of the negotiating team, because your example, but also your model, seems a very good one. And I hope we can get your slides, that we can have a closer look at it. But is that feasible to put that sort of thinking in a pandemic treaty? I'm not an expert in these issues, so that's why it intrigues me a little bit. I first give the floor to Mr. Ugarte and then Professor Moon to answer the question, and then we proceed.
Thank you so much for those two questions. I may answer in English both questions. First on the production of Europe and how this can support the Americas. Of course, in very there are very areas where we can work together. First, I believe that we need to enhance the interactions from Europe with the Americas, and I would say with all the regions actually. There are several areas where there are, of course, Europe interest in other regions, but particularly there are populations in those regions that also look and are part of the European Union as overseas territories, but also as part of the culture that we have, particularly in the Americas, for example, with Europe. And in that regards, that the engagement with regional entities and mechanisms is highly needed, because when the next pandemic will come, the channels will be open, but particularly will be useful if that engagement is a meaningful engagement, not as subjects of assistance, but as subjects of cooperation, as partners. And in that regards, that means that the transfer of technology is and the cooperation to production of critical supplies, also in the region of the Americas, is a critical part of it. Actually, the Americas is highly dependent on importation from other regions. During the pandemic, in some instances, more than 90% of the supplies that were used in the Americas were imported from other regions, and of course at the mercy of the global supply chain and the industry the industries that were looking more at revenue than in supporting the countries or building the capacity of other countries. Actually, the clever decision would be to expand that capacity and have local production. But that is not the case, has not been the case during the pandemic. Regarding the logistics, the countries in the Americas decided to have a regional logistics system for emergencies. It was originally for disasters, but it was expanded to pandemics after the H1N1 pandemic in 2009. And that was the only source of PPEs, critical equipment, and other supplies that were sent to the countries in the Americas because the global supply chain collapsed and most of those supplies were going to other regions or big countries. So that is part of one of the lessons that we learned. And as we speak, we are dealing with almost 7 big emergencies in the Americas, and that logistic system is working. The way that it works is that some of the countries do have hubs of those logistic network, and they may provide those supplies and critical equipment to other countries as part of the regional mechanism. Still, there is a lot to be strengthened, but that is I would say, the biggest strength in the Americas when we are dealing with emergencies. Cuba, for example, received 10 tons of medicines and supplies from the humanitarian hub of PAHO in Panama in less than 24 hours after the Hurricane Ian. So that is showing that we do have the capacity. Regarding the corruption, I think this is something that we need to look at the transparency of the system and do not hide on the emergency declaration to make any decision, whatever the cost it is. Actually, that is also it is a joint work between the public sector, the private sector, but particularly from the beginning, there must be a monitor and control system in place. You know very well, when an emergency is declared, there are biggest opportunities to purchase, to contracts, to do investments without the proper accountability and monitoring. We need to enhance that capacity because the corruption, unfortunately, if that would be just losing money, maybe it would be less, hurting that when people die, when people suffer. And that was the case in many countries, not only in the Americas. Regarding the decision of the vaccines, most of the countries did not want to join COVAX at the beginning, but then when they joined COVAX, and I will provide some additional comments on what is our perspective of COVAX, they didn't receive the vaccines on time. But as you know also, there were other vaccines that were not proved, that were not properly vetted, but they were available. And for some countries, that was the only source of vaccines. And the leaders of the countries need to show that they are protecting their communities. And in many of those cases, they decided to do so, looking for other vaccines, not only from China or other countries or Russia, but also from other countries, because that was the only source of something that must be done for their countries, even though there was no clear evidence of that. But you know very well also, in this pandemic and the next pandemic, there will not be strong evidence early in the process. There will always be a discussion, an ethical discussion on the interventions and treatments and public health measures. There will always be. But in that regard, that must be a collective decision with all political visions, but also the key aspect, the key sectors involved in that decision. Regarding COVAX, we believe that COVAX was the only option for the countries that do not have the manufacturing capacity or the big money to access vaccines. Okay, I would say just direct this. I think the equity, that is one of the reasons to establish COVAX, was one of the first victims of COVAX. Let me expand on that. The Americas was heavily affected. Still, most of the vaccines were distributed to other regions that didn't have cases. They were not dealing with emergency. While in the Americas, the emergency was rampant in many countries, and the countries that were part of COVAX did not receive those vaccines on time. The other problem that we saw there is that the timing of the arrival of the vaccines and the process itself was not easy to do. So, in conclusion, in the Americas, we applied more than 1 billion doses of vaccines. How many doses were applied through COVAX? 150 million. So you see the difference. So clearly there is something to be fixed there. And then we think that the COVAX mechanism is a mechanism that helped many countries, but at the same time, it's far from being enough, far from being the ideal mechanism. We need to work on some sort of cooperation between regions and countries and the industry for regional production. And I see, for example, in terms of IHR. In terms of IHR, there are several aspects that need to be enhanced. First, the information sharing, the access to evaluation. If we would be able to send to the countries to accept the arrival of international experts to assess the situation and to look directly on the issues, we would be better off. We were not being able to do that. So that information sharing from the countries that do have information, but also to allow the other countries, that's one part. The other one is the implementation of public health measures.
Dr. Ugarte, just because it's already 10 minutes and there's a lot of other questions coming up, so if you can wrap up for these answers.
So in that regard, okay, sorry, Chair. In that regard, I would say, yes, we need to look for other instruments. But before deciding on which instruments, we need to do a proper analysis what the problem is. We are now implementing or looking at many initiatives and solutions without knowing what the problem is. We need to identify the problem and then look for the solution, not the other way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Moon, please.
Thank you very much. Let me try to briefly address first Madame Montserrat's question about the use of Chinese and Russian vaccines, because this is an area on which my center has been doing quite a bit of research. What we found is that actually the volume of Russian vaccines that were used has been quite low. There was a lot of public attention when the first Sputnik vaccine was approved. There were many announcements of technology transfer agreements, for example, but largely the supply of those vaccines seems to have gone to a few countries, primarily in the Central Asian region and in other parts of the world. The situation with Chinese vaccines is very different. We had more vaccines exported by China to the rest of the world, particularly developing countries, than all of COVAX combined over the last year. So COVAX, I think, has made a tremendous contribution, with about 1.7 billion doses supplied as of a couple of months ago, and China about 2 billion as of May, 2 billion doses. But the mode of supply is quite different, and the rationale for why countries use those vaccines is quite different. I think, indeed, the Chinese vaccines were available earlier as to many countries, as Dr. Ugarte just highlighted. Those vaccines were given WHO pre-qualification, so they did pass the bar that WHO set for safety and efficacy data. They also often came with offers of technology transfer that many countries found very attractive. So, for example, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Indonesia, and other parts of the world, there was an interest in having vaccine access side by side with technology transfer. Last but not least, there was a quid pro quo. So if you remember, China has actually been, with its zero COVID policy, it has dramatically suppressed the number of cases that they have. Of course, from a public health perspective, this is excellent. This is what you want to see. But you cannot develop a vaccine if you don't have very many cases. So for Chinese firms to be able to finish their vaccine development, they needed to find clinical trial sites in other parts of the world. So there was something that Chinese firms gained from supplying vaccines to countries that were willing to host those clinical trial sites, and there was something that those countries gained in terms of access, familiarity with the vaccine, and in some cases, technology transfer as well. But this leads me actually to the question that the chair has raised regarding, I think, the question of sanctions, but also what makes for more durable agreements in an instrument like the Pandemic Treaty or in the IHR for that matter. And I do believe that in general in life, but certainly in international affairs, that both carrots and sticks are important in order to try to nudge countries and other actors into doing what is best for the global public interest. And of course, the sanctions have to be carefully applied, but in an ideal scenario, you never have to apply the sanctions. The existence of the sanctions is what encourages actors to do the right thing for the global community when crisis hits, such as the sharing of information, for example. But there's another logic to international agreements that I think is important to put on the table, and that is the logic that I was just mentioning, which is quid pro quo, the logic where every country benefits from adhering to a certain set of rules, and they have a strong incentive, even in the political heat of a crisis, even in a health emergency, there's a very strong incentive to keep following the rules they've agreed to, because that, is also in your own self-interest. And this is what we saw with the Chinese vaccine companies who were, as I mentioned, looking for clinical trial sites in countries that were looking for vaccine doses. This quid pro quo logic, or rules that benefit everybody, is very different from the logic of charity that I think many of us were hoping would be strong enough in the pandemic, but I think we saw it simply was not strong enough. And I think countries do not want to rely on a logic of charity in the future when it comes to vaccine access. This is the reason, and this is my last comment, this is the reason why I think it's very important that countries at all levels of income, whether it's Europe or Latin America or Asia, Africa, etc., are willing to contribute financially to research and development. They put money on the table, but they're also then able to get access to the technology and the intellectual property and the innovation that results. And it's this kind of bargain, grand bargain, that I think is more durable than counting on charity in the future. Over.
Thank you very much. Absolutely agree with that last remark. Mr. Gluck, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have two questions. First question is going to Dr. Ugarte. From your perspective as Americas and as PAHO, what do you think? How was it that the European Union dealt with the problem? From the position of an outside person, what do you believe? How did the European Union handle the problem of getting vaccines? Second question: the Americas represent a very heterogeneous group of countries, which on one hand, there's large vaccine producers, and on the other hand, other countries could not grant equal access to vaccines to all its members. So what was the key problem? Was the problem a lack of production side, a lack of too many IP rights, or was it a question of affordability? Second question to Professor Moon. We are here, what I already called the bottleneck, the bottleneck committee, and we want to identify bottlenecks. So also from your perspective, what has been the biggest problem in the rollout of production of vaccines? Was it same thing? Was it IP rights? Was it production sites? Where was the problem? And also maybe very interesting for you, because you also had an eye on other vaccines which were not approved in the European Union. So, for example, Chinese or Russian vaccines. Where was the problem of the rollout there? Is it also like IP rights or production sites, or what was it? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Metz, please.
Thank you, dear Chair, for giving me the floor. Thank you also to Dr. Ugarte and Professor Moon for the presentation. The pandemic exacerbated existing inequities in South American region, widening really the gap. In Latin America and in the Caribbean, poverty had been showing an upward trend, rising from 27.8 in 2014 to 3.7 in 2022, representing 22 million and more people living below the poverty line, of whom 8 million, so 36%, are in extreme poverty. And this COVID-19 pandemic contributed to this trend becoming more pronounced in 2020 because the pandemic has disproportionately affected economically disadvantaged groups. So could you share with us, mainly a question to PAHO, to Dr. Ugarte, could you share with us some of the most important findings on this regard, plus adjoining policy recommendation or strategic priorities? No, it's also a question for Professor Moon. Sorry, for both of you, I think. And also another question I have, could you share with us some insights on local medicine production capacities? We show an example, which I've seen an example from India, but what are the local medicine production capacities of the South American region and a possible dependence on the North American region? And my last question is regarding the pandemic treaty. How do both of you see the ongoing discussion for pathogen and benefit sharing at the international negotiating body that is preparing this pandemic treaty? What should be really the outcome? You mentioned already important elements, but what should be the outcome in the treaty regarding this? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. De La Pisa.
Muchas gracias, presidente. Gracias a los ponentes. Yo tengo dos preguntas. La primera para el doctor Ciro Ugarte. Hoy ha hecho mención a las alertas que se suscitan en un primer momento entre las oficinas regionales de la Organización Mundial de la Salud con la intención de despertar una respuesta internacional. La Organización Panamericana de la Salud emitió su primera alerta epidemiológica el 16 de enero del 2020. Antes que la Oficina Regional Europea o que la región del sudeste asiático, que esperaron hasta el 25 y 27 de enero respectivamente. La Organización Panamericana de la Salud fue más rápida en emitir la alerta. ¿Qué tuvieron en cuenta en la valoración del riesgo? Porque aún no conociéndose casos en su región de COVID, vuestra región fue más rápida, correctamente, y fueron los primeros en percibir este riesgo. Recordemos que la situación del origen, de Wuhan o incluso en Italia, despertaron alertas más tardías. ¿Cree que el Reglamento Sanitario Internacional para prevenir la dispersión de epidemias en pandemias en el mundo del 2015 fue convenientemente aplicado por todos los Estados? Mencionó que no se habían aplicado sanciones, que era importante identificar los problemas. ¿Cree que ha sido convenientemente investigado? Por otro lado, una segunda pregunta para la señora Mu, de Global Health Center. Ha comentado la importancia del acceso a la tecnología y cómo la financiación pública europea había conseguido una reacción más rápida. La realidad es que esto ha sido así, pero apostar por unos productos concretos como la vacuna RNA, con acuerdos de compra de millones de dosis, hablamos de más de 10 dosis por habitante, ha podido colmar un mercado que hoy no permite la entrada de nuevos productos innovadores, Por fomentar la innovación demasiado en un primer momento o apoyar a unos productos concretos, no estamos permitiendo que entren otros. Esto justo acaba con la innovación, Sabemos que existen tratamientos preventivos para las personas vulnerables, sabemos que hay otras nuevas vacunas con otro diseño y que aportan ventajas. Las empresas que están desarrollando estos productos no tienen en absoluto el mismo apoyo a la innovación o al desarrollo de estas nuevas tecnologías que tuvieron las primeras vacunas, impidiéndonos a todos disfrutar de estos avances. ¿No cree que unos acuerdos de compra que a lo mejor se están alargando en el tiempo puede haber interferido en un mercado de sana competencia que impide, ¿no?, que una selección de los productos de calidad por parte de los clientes suceda? Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Professor Moon, I give you the floor first, and then Dr. Ugarte.
Sorry, I think I may have missed. I'm first?
Yes, you first.
Yes. Okay. Thanks
I like
very
to
much.
change once in a while.
Okay.
That's why.
You keep me on my toes. So first, in response to Mr. Gluck's question about bottlenecks in the rollout, of course, there were many challenges that I imagine are very familiar to members of the committee, so I won't go through all of them, including, of course, hesitancy, supply chain challenges, etc. I do think there was a very big problem of scarcity. There simply weren't enough doses to go around, and the doses that were produced in the first months of 2021, for example, went first to the richest countries, as everybody, I think, is now very aware. So a problem that they did not go to the most vulnerable people around the world. And I do believe that an important way of addressing this is by expanding production. I think in a better world, we would have had very proactive efforts early on to enable production of vaccines in different parts of the world. And intellectual property rights is an important piece of that puzzle. There are many patents, of course, on vaccines and their components, as well as on medicines, on drugs and diagnostics. IP is not the only issue, but it is one issue. And what we need to do, I think, ultimately is to design technology transfer and to design the sharing of intellectual property and knowledge into the system from the beginning. So we are not trying to force companies against their will to do something in the event of a crisis, that this is already part of the plan, so to speak. This, I think, segues nicely into the question from Madame Metz regarding local production capacity. For example, in the Latin American region, there is, to my understanding, considerable production capacity for drugs, small molecule drugs, some production capacity for vaccines, and today more political will than I've ever seen in 20 years of working on this issue to invest in building up that capacity. We have a very important opportunity in the next couple of years to build up that capacity in many regions around the world, including in Latin America. But not only. But the issue that you raised regarding sample sharing and the pandemic treaty, I think, is really essential. And it's actually a great example of why it's important to get the rules right. And so for those who may not follow this issue as closely, let me just summarize it by saying a new virus or other pathogen can pop up anywhere in the world. In an ideal situation, that country immediately shares a physical sample with the scientific community globally, and they immediately share the data, the genomic sequencing data, as it's called, from that pathogen with the global scientific community. However, in the past, countries have been slow to share the sample or the data for a number of different reasons. One of the reasons is that they don't think they will have access to the vaccines or drugs that will result. This puts the rest of the world at great risk. And this is actually a prime opportunity for crafting this grand bargain, this quid pro quo that I was speaking about. Europe will be better protected from future crises if all countries are willing to share information quickly about any kind of new outbreak. Other countries will be better protected if they feel that once they share that information, they have guaranteed access to any technology that is developed based on that information. This is a great example of how countries' health security is very much interdependent, but if we can't agree on specific, clear rules that obligate all countries to share data and samples and obligate all countries to share technology, intellectual property, and knowledge, then everybody else is worse off. I do believe such a grand bargain is possible to strike in the pandemic treaty negotiations. Those remain, I would say, at a very early stage still. They remain relatively nascent. We're awaiting what we're calling the conceptual zero draft, due out in a few short weeks from now. I do think in 2023 there will be much more momentum on getting getting much more concrete. But I think it's important that the Parliament remains quite engaged in overseeing the EU's engagement in those negotiations, and that a durable bargain that serves everybody's needs is struck. That is in the interests of Europe, and it's also in the interests of the rest of the world. To Madame de la Pisa-Carrion's question, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I fully grasped it, so I'm wondering if perhaps the chair could summarize for me, or if somebody else could perhaps help me with the
I'll ask Mr. Lapisa to summarize it herself. I think that's safer.
Sí, sí, el hecho de haber promocionado en un primer momento las primeras vacunas, las de RNA mensajero, y haber llegado a acuerdos de compra sustanciosos, ¿no?, que colman un mercado, no está impidiendo la entrada de nuevos productos, de vacunas con otros diseños, ¿no?, o con otros tratamientos, porque ya se ha invertido tanto, o sea, se ha apostado por las primeras vacunas y hoy ya no hay apoyo, ¿no?, por otros tratamientos. O sea, les está apoyando la innovación, pero, bueno, se apoyó la innovación de unos productos, pero ¿cree usted que esto está limitando la entrada de otros, de nuevos medicamentos, ¿no?, con otros diseños? O, por ejemplo, hay medicamentos preventivos que se ve que serían especialmente útiles para evitar lockdowns en el futuro, porque las personas vulnerables podían utilizarlos y en vez de que sea un tratamiento que utilice toda la población, se destinaría a este tipo de pacientes, ¿no? Pues sabemos de productos de este tipo que no están encontrando un apoyo, como ocurrió con las primeras vacunas, ¿no? También hay vacunas con otro diseño, que ya no son RNA mensajero, son proteínas de RNA recombinante que cogen trocitos de la proteína Spike, de manera que no son tienen una reacción medida, ¿no?, y en muchos casos menores efectos secundarios. Pero esas vacunas pasa lo mismo. Como ya hay un mercado de vacunas satisfecho por un esfuerzo de la Comisión de comprar y de satisfacer un mercado, no están encontrando la posibilidad de introducir este producto en el mercado. Se les está poniendo unos requisitos de autorización mayores y también ven que no van a tener incluso la posibilidad comercial de vender sus productos en un mercado que ya está colmado porque la Comisión ha comprado por todos, ¿no? Gracias.
Okay, that was a large summarizing.
Sorry.
No problem.
Thank you. I'll do my best to respond. I'm not sure I have the appropriate expertise. We do have a challenge in general with biomedical innovation that not every product that is useful or beneficial for health ends up making it through the development process. Sometimes because of, for economic reasons, because of the market, I think, as you've very, very nicely described. And I do think this is why it's important to have multiple sources of innovation, and why having more international cooperation actually allows for different kinds of vaccines or drugs or diagnostics or other products to be developed that might be more suitable for some population groups versus others. That diversity of innovative effort is actually a good thing for patients, for society. But I think the other key point that your comment raises is the importance of public support, because there are many ways in which market mechanisms do not necessarily bring the best innovation to people. They don't necessarily, of course, make those innovations available at an affordable price. So you need to have a very strong stewardship role, I would say, by the public sector in order to ensure that the needs of minority groups or vulnerable groups, or sometimes children, pregnant women, other subpopulations are met through pharmaceutical innovation, and usually the market will not deliver that. You need to have very clear and targeted public policy. So I hope I've responded to your question, but sorry if I have not. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Dr. Ugarte, please.
Thank you. First, regarding the how the European Union dealt with the pandemic, and particularly with the problem of getting vaccines and also other decisions that were taken. And it is clear that, yes, the European Union is heterogeneous, has heterogeneous membership. But we, from the Americas, looked at Europe both because of its capacity to come together very early in the process, and also looking at that many of the countries in the European Union dealt with big emergencies, and we were looking for the experience of Europe to how that experience can be translated to the Americas. So I believe that a proper analysis and a proper assessment of the European Union or European countries or Europe in general, how Europe responded to the pandemic, is highly needed. We need a proper assessment. That proper assessment will probably look for those answers that we do not have from the Americas. But I would like to highlight that very early in the process, Europe was a source of support for the countries in the Americas, both as a regional body, but also individual countries like Spain, Portugal, France, the UK, Germany, provided technical support, but also additional guidance to the countries themselves. We organized meetings with the ministries of health or the directors of epidemiology or the ones that were dealing with COVID-19 at the beginning of the pandemic, and they learned many of those measures that were taken, both the good ones and also the ones that did not work well. Both were very useful for our country. So in that regard, I would like to highlight that cooperation that continues today. And with monkeypox also was another source of common understanding, but also dealing together with those uncertainties. Regarding which were the biggest impacts in the vulnerable population, unfortunately we saw that informal workers, migrants, people living in overcrowded conditions, but also in several other economic disadvantage, race, gender, income level, and also geographic location were heavily impacted by COVID-19. And we saw, for example, from the reports of the countries that the biggest impact was at the first level of care. Particularly 70% of the countries reported that they had a disruption at the first level of care. You imagine, disruption at the first level of care means that they do not have access to critical, basic health services, both in care but also in public health measures. Immunizations, for example, was affected by 69% of the countries reported a heavy impact in immunization. And immunization, of course, with children, women, and others, but to other groups. But we have seen that the immunization program in the Americas has suffered a lot because of the pandemic. The campaigns were not implemented, but also the hesitancy for COVID-19 vaccines, the new vaccines, also had a spread to other types of vaccines. So we are dealing now with big issues regarding immunization. The care of older people also was reported by 67% of the countries. So there are many other aspects I would like to highlight, but one of the most important, in my opinion, is mental health. Mental health, I believe that it is the new pandemic. And this is a silent pandemic, and it's happening as we speak. And it is not having the proper look at mental health. And if we don't look at that, it will have the biggest impact in all areas of work. And unfortunately, that is not being dealt by the countries at the level that it should be. So we are looking also at those aspects, but the group that was also at higher risk, as you know very well, were the healthcare workers, without proper protection, but also without proper salary, with increase of the workload, and then not enough compensation. As you know very well, in several areas, they were applauded during the day, but were not being allowed to enter to their communities at night because of the risk of having them in their areas. And regarding the local medicine production, we see that there are there are several countries that have the capacity to produce medicines and supplies. Most of those countries also have this the capacity to deal with other regions or in cooperation with other regions. So the production is being done in the Americas, both the vaccines, for example, that are produced in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Argentina, and other countries that are part of the bigger companies. So there is a capacity, and that is particularly one of the areas where the member states in the Americas requested PAHO to do, and we have identified two hubs for the production of capacity of vaccines. One is the Biomanguinhos Institute in Brazil, and another biotech company in Argentina. But also we are doing a proper assessment of the capacities of production of medicines and other supplies in several countries in the Americas. So we are doing now the assessment of what is the capacity, how we can deal with that together, and that's a process that is happening, for example, in the case of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Peru, in relation with the production of medicines and vaccines and other technologies, but also in the progress and experience and lessons learned concerning supply chains or logistics during the pandemic, like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Haiti, Jamaica, Mexico, Paraguay, and Suriname. So there are many countries that are participating in this process because they felt all the challenge that it came with. Regarding the pandemic treaty, how the negotiations are being done? Okay, most of the negotiations are being done by the permanent missions of the countries in Geneva. Not all countries in the Americas have permanent missions in Geneva. And the ones that do have small permanent missions. So when I discussed with the ministers of health at the Pan American Sanitary Conference 3 weeks ago, very few of them, maybe one or two, were involved in the process. So how come that these negotiations are happening on the sides, and this is one of the biggest challenges for the Americas. So we are organizing a meeting with the ministers of health, foreign affairs, and other key actors to be involved in the IMB, but also in the process of negotiation, because it will be late for the decision when they arrive at the conclusion.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mrs. Matias.
Muito obrigada, Presidente. Quero agradecer também aos nossos convidados. A minha pergunta é para a professora Moon. Lembrou-nos, e bem, na sua apresentação, que os acordos de compras de vacinas que foram feitos, em particular na União Europeia, não foram acordos tradicionais. Um acordo tradicional seria o tipo de acordo em que se paga no final do produto. Pelo contrário, foram pagamentos feitos no início e em que assumimos todos os riscos. E falou também da necessidade de aumentar a capacidade de produção da vacina e, nesse contexto, podermos ter, se calhar, um modelo mais próximo da ideia original da vacina como um bem comum global e não aquilo que se transformou depois. E a minha pergunta muito concreta é, não parecendo haver, ou ter havido até agora, vontade política para isso, porque sempre foi referido um conjunto de dificuldades que existiriam na transferência de tecnologia, na capacidade de produção, etc. todas essas lacunas acabaram por transformar o acesso à vacina numa espécie de um enorme falhanço moral. Um falhanço moral da nossa parte que creio que ajudou a agravar as desigualdades globais. Imaginando que este cenário mudava e que seria possível, eu espero que sim, maior partilha de dados, maior partilha de tecnologia, maior alargamento da capacidade de produção, imaginando tudo isto, a minha pergunta é muito direta, ao contrário se calhar desta introdução, a minha pergunta é muito direta, é em que medida é que tudo isto seria possível no contexto atual de proteção da propriedade intelectual e no modelo de patentes que temos em vigor. Muito obrigada.
Mr. Sinčić.
Hvala vam lijepo, predsjedavajuća. Danas ću govoriti hrvatski. Moram konstatirati da smo na ovom odboru, na odboru COVID, specijalnom odboru za korona krizu razgovarali gotovo isključivo o cjepivima i svemu što ide uz njih. Vrijedi spomenuti naravno i mnoga druga rješenja, svakako jeftinija, koja se koriste već desetljećima. Imao sam prilike razgovarati sa brazilskim, kanadskim, talijanskim, američkim, južnoafričkim, indijskim i drugim liječnicima koji na prvoj liniji u ordinacijama i bolnicama liječe pacijente i oni su jako zadovoljni protokolima liječenja ranim tretmanima. Sada već postoje desetine protokola, a dva su najznačajnija. Sa listopadom 2022. lijek hidroksiklorokvin ima 367 studija koje uspoređuju tretiranu grupu i kontrolnu grupu koje je proizvelo 5940 znanstvenika na preko 493.000 pacijenata u 53 zemlje. Za rano liječenje COVID-a ovaj lijek je uveden u 35 zemalja ili dijelovima tih zemalja, odnosno u 52 zemlje u svijetu ako se uključe nevladine medicinske organizacije. Lijek, pokazuju te studije, ako se koristi u ispravnim dozama i na vrijeme, pokazuje dosljedno pozitivne rezultate. Za rano liječenje poboljšanje je čak 62%. Još boljim se pokazao drugi lijek. Sa listopadom 2022. lijek Ivermectin ima 92 studije koje uspoređuju također tretiranu grupu i kontrolnu grupu koje je provelo 1006 znanstvenika na preko 134.000 pacijenata u 27 zemalja. Za rano liječenje COVID-a ovaj lijek je uveden u 22 zemlje ili njihovim dijelovima, odnosno 39 zemalja ako se uključe nevladine medicinske organizacije. Ako se ispravno koristi, pokazuju studije, lijek pokazuje poboljšanja od čak 83% u profilaksi i 62% kod ranog liječenja. Moje pitanje za gospodina Ugartea je kakva su vaša iskustva u zemljama koje pokriva vaša organizacija sa ranim tretmanima, koja je uloga ranih tretmana u suzbijanju COVID-a u vašim zemljama kojima djeluje Panamerička zdravstvena organizacija? Hvala.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Trille-Lenoir.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I would like to address my question to Mr. Ugarte and thank him for a very interesting experience, which is inspiring to us. We are concerned by many topics where lessons have to be learned, and I would like to know how you address some of them. Precisely, what are the actions and measures that your organization takes to fight against misinformation and fake news, which slow down vaccination campaigns? As far as the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned, could you tell us what are your most recent results in terms of expectancy and resilience of the national health systems? And I'm also interested to know if you have data on the impact on non-communicable diseases. You have been talking about mental health, but what about patients with cancers during the pandemics in the Americas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Olekas?
Thank you very much for your information. My question, I have two questions. First of all, Dr. Ugarte mentioned about the problems in primary health care. And he mentioned some problems regarding that. And I would like to ask you maybe a little bit more inform us. What do you see the more important reason for these problems? This is our citizen trust, or this the organizational system, or the supply of vaccine. This is the most important, how we can change the situation in primary care, and what is the experience from the South America. Maybe different systems have the better possibilities or not. The second one is more about the vaccines, about the compatibility of vaccines, because as you mentioned, you have the different vaccines from China, Russia, and from different Western world companies, and vaccination, revaccination with different types of vaccine. Do you have some different results, and can you explain for us? And the last question is about the resources. And there are some criticism here in the European and our Parliament that the profits of the pharmaceutical companies is raised in very, very high numbers. And do you see the possibilities or your suggestion to have some limit of profit and to use these resources for the support of different countries and citizens? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And finally, Mrs. Metz, you want to come back for Mrs. Paulus, who had to leave?
Yes, exactly. So it's a question for Professor Moon on behalf of my Green colleague, Jutta Paulus. So she said that she's very interested in the proceedings around the patent-free vaccine you had presented. Apart from public funding for actual research, investment had to be made into clinical studies also. This usually adds up to 7 or 8-digit numbers. How could the producer in India make sure that they would get their money back, given that anyone could produce a vaccine and make use of their studies? How does licensing work if there is no patent in the first place? So that's from Jutta Paulus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that concludes the questions. We're running a little bit out of time, as usual. So take your time to answer the questions, but really be as precise as possible. I first give the floor to Dr. Ugarte, please.
Thank you so much. Yes, there are many very important questions, and I would like to highlight that my answers will be straightforward in most of them. First, on the intellectual property, on the vaccine as a global good, a common good. I think the system is not working properly to have a new area where we can look at the vaccine supplies and critical medicines that will be available for everybody. And but the solidarity, the equity, and how we can approach this is a need, and probably that would be one of the areas where a new treaty will have a place in a negotiation. But that must be done in a way that we do not dream a lot, but probably sleep better, to have a proper understanding of this and looking at the reality and not just having a wish that may become, unfortunately, a bad dream, that will prevent us from doing the important things. Regarding the use of other medicines and supplies, most of the countries in the Americas also look at the other measures because they didn't have the vaccine, they didn't have the antivirus, they didn't have many other things. But we did an analysis, a deep analysis of most of those supplies, including hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and others. And there is a very nice report on how those products were useful or not. And there is another side of this. It is the economic side of this, the benefits, the economic benefits from the producers of those, but also how these medicines were available at higher prices, and because of the persons that were looking at them as the only source of treatment, of course the prices were very high and they were scarce for the diseases that they would serve for. So these are areas that I would be happy to share with you. There are ethical approaches to that, and also how will they benefit it or not, the population. They're clear understanding. It is not just how many countries are using, but are the evidence is there or not. So that part. Regarding the lessons learned on misinformation, I would like to highlight that also this is a big problem in the Americas, that we have been dealing particularly with the communities, together with the member states, and entering the social media. But I think while we produce all our formal reports in our webpage and also through maybe press briefings or maybe formal reports, everything that is going to the community is going through social media. And most of the governments are not entering enough in social media. So misinformation spreads faster than any virus. And it has a huge impact. We are not there yet, but there are many processes that are being implemented, particularly to reach those communities with vaccines hesitancy, but also using other medicines or products that may not help them in that process. Regarding resilient health systems, this is a process that the countries in the America requested to PAHO to establish a policy. There is a policy that was approved by the member states, but the progress in how strengthening the capacity of the services is not there yet. And I think why the public health or the primary health care was heavily affected, it was two sides. One is because of the lockdown, and the priority for other, or COVID-19 priority besides other priorities, that's one of the areas. But the other one is that, yes, the primary health care is looked at the first level, only at the first level of care. But you may know that primary health care can be provided in tertiary level, in the institutes. But that vision is not shared by all the countries, and unfortunately we are seeing that it is not a matter of trust. It is not really a matter of capacity. It is a matter of how these areas can be linked together as networks. And finally, on the compatibility of vaccines and other resources, we did have those issues in many countries. And unfortunately, if you don't have other vaccine, you use the first vaccine that is available. And then there is not yet a proper analysis of that compatibility, but clearly when we look at the results of how many of those persons that were vaccinated with one or others, or maybe a mix of vaccines, we see that they were protected. There were less hospitalization and less deaths in that regard. And I want to thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ugarte, for these answers. Professor Moon, please.
Thank you very much. Let me begin actually with the question from Mr. Olekas, because I think this is also the point that Dr. Ugarte ended on. Indeed, we have a fair amount of observational evidence from people who did end up taking vaccines from different suppliers. But we don't have, for example, randomized controlled trials, the gold standard in biomedical research and development, comparing different combinations of vaccines from different producers in general, because that's not something that companies generally do. And it is an important scientific question that I think highlights the importance of having adequate public investment in research and development, because sometimes there are important questions that need to be answered, but they will not be answered based on market incentives alone. We have to have a strong public investment to ask and answer those kinds of questions through through appropriately designed trials. But let me come to the other two questions that were addressed to me regarding intellectual property, how to make vaccines a common good in a practical way. The question raised by Madame Matias and also by Madame Metz on behalf of the Greens regarding how do you license a product with no patent? What does that really mean? So I want to come back to the earlier slide where I emphasized the important role of the public sector in pandemic-related technologies. Why is that the case? This is the case because if you think about monkeypox or COVID or even Ebola, we don't know when the next outbreak will be. We don't know what that pathogen will look like. We don't know how many cases there will be. And this is an area that is too risky for industry to take on alone. And that's why, in general, across the countries that have very well-developed biosecurity research and development systems, this is a government system. And there's just a handful of countries that have such systems. So it's widely understood and accepted that you have to have public money. What has not been the case so far is that public money has been used with an intention to serve the global public good. Primarily, that public money has been used to serve the national interest and usually for national security purposes, to protect people in one country from threats coming from outside the country. Of course, what we understand today, better than we ever have before, is how closely interconnected and how interdependent we all are on the protection of the health of people in another part of the world. And so to protect our own national security, to protect our own national public health, it makes perfect sense for us to also help other countries to protect health, the health of their people. And I think this is where there's a huge opportunity. Because it's public money, you can change the intention of the use of that public money, of that taxpayer money, to say we want that taxpayer money to be used to develop products for potential pandemics in such a manner that by design they are made available to the world, that there are no access barriers to those technologies. And the way to do that is by investing that money strategically, but also to tie the right access conditions to that money. So I think it's very, very practical and possible. The reason I presented the Baylor vaccine example is to show that it is possible, even in an area that is hugely profitable, by the way, coming to the point that Mr. Alekas raised earlier. This is a hugely profitable market for COVID-19 vaccines. Even in such a profitable market, it was possible to develop a vaccine using a different business model. Now, coming to the question on, what do I mean by licensing if there's no patents? So indeed, there have been no patent applications filed by Baylor because the whole purpose of their R&D project was to make it available for different countries to use. What they have done, when I use the word license, perhaps it's not the best word to use. What they have done is they have proactively offered to transfer technology. So not just to say, you can use our candidate, we will not sue you for IP infringement. What they have done is actually say, if you would like to develop this candidate, run it through clinical trials to manufacture it, we will give you the data. We will give you the raw materials that you may need. We will support you. You can ask us. You can call us and say, we're having problems with this part of the manufacturing process. We will help you to actually manufacture this. And this is because this is the mission, this is the purpose of this particular nonprofit entity that is based in an academic institution. And so that's what I mean by licensing. Now, Biological E, the company in India, can make a profit. It is a for-profit firm. It is not a NGO. Biological E can earn money off of this COVID-19 vaccine for two reasons. The first reason is that the Indian government seems to have committed to purchase a fair number of I think the main customer for Biological E is the Indian government, and this has been true for most COVID-19 vaccines. They are purchased by governments. I think they've sold 100 million doses to the Indian government. So that de-risking by the government allows them to invest in clinical trials. But the other reason is that vaccines are quite different from drugs in that it is often possible to it's harder to, there are a lot higher barriers to entry in the market. So it's harder to develop a direct competitor. And so there are still ways for vaccine producers, even without a monopoly or even without intellectual property protection, to keep certain parts of the market for themselves, to earn enough profit to be able to invest, for example, in a clinical trial. So there's certain features of the vaccine market that allow them to do that, but there's also this important role that the Indian government has played. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Moon, and thanks to both speakers in this session. I think it was extremely interesting. Thanks a lot, and if you have still remaining questions, we'll get back to you, and I'm quite sure that you made a very valuable contribution to our lessons learned when it comes to the global vaccination strategy. I now move to our last point, and I know it's already been very tiring. Please, Dimitri Einekel, please come and sit next to me. There's been a last change of agenda, well, not of agenda, but of the person to be here to make the introduction and answer all the questions. Unfortunately, and due to unforeseen circumstances, Dr. Tubau was unable to join, but we have a very good replacer today. Dimitri, we welcome Senior Policy Analyst of Doctors Without Borders, joins us today to speak on behalf of Dr. Tubau, and we thank you very much for your presence here. MSF was an important proponent of the TRIPS waiver and has not shied away from criticising the way COVAX was set up, and we would like to hear which problems you identified during the pandemic and what the international community, and particularly, of course, the EU, should do for the future. We have like an hour for this discussion, so please take your time for your introduction, and then we move to the questions. Thank you very much. You have the floor, Dimitri.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Dear Chair, honourable members of the European Parliament. First of all, I would like to apologise on behalf of the Director, Joan Tubau, who indeed, due to unforeseen circumstances, couldn't make it. But I'm happy to present his statement here, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have. So first, I would like to express my gratitude for inviting Médecins Sans Frontières to this committee and our appreciation for your endeavour to draw lessons learned from the EU's response to the pandemic, including the attention to the global response. May I first make it clear that MSF is an independent medical humanitarian organisation that provides healthcare in more than 70 countries. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, MSF teams responded to the health crisis in 76 countries through more than 350 projects aimed at maintaining essential medical services and protecting vulnerable people, including via vaccination. These included EU countries where we focused on access to care for vulnerable and marginalised populations, such as the elderly and migrants. MSF's Access campaign advocates for better global access to medical tools since 1999. As the Access campaign's EU representative, I'm going to focus my statement on comprehensive and equitable global access to COVID-19 tools, including vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments. So all equipment and not only vaccines, for which there's a lot of attention. While the rapid rate at which scientists produced multiple highly effective COVID-19 tools has been a monumental and public health achievement, efforts to equitably distribute those life-saving tools have been an epic failure. The inequities observed can be linked to some structural and systematic flaws in the global COVID-19 response. So I will first present what has not worked and why, and secondly, point out a number of opportunities that arise. First, we witnessed insufficient global governance of the temporary global mechanisms, combined with ineffective mechanisms for global allocation and a lack of global solidarity. Ad hoc mechanisms as the ACT Accelerator, known as ACT A, of which COVAX is the vaccine pillar, so COVAX is part of ACT A, were created with EU support to ensure better global access. Yes, they have largely proven to be ineffective. Most high and middle income countries managed almost the entire crisis outside of the ACT A pillars. Low-income countries were the last to receive access to the COVID-19 tools. The goals set by ACT A and its pillars were not achieved. Some examples: COVAX aimed to procure and deliver 2 billion doses in 2021, but less than 1 billion doses were delivered by the end of the year, 40% of them being donated doses. Act A delivered only 3% of the COVID-19 test volumes that they intended to deliver. Some voluntary licenses have been issued for access to generic COVID-19 treatments, but these licenses are too limited and too restrictive. The inequity in results can be rooted in the lack of equitable representation in Act A's governance. Low and middle-income countries' involvement in Act A was limited to being recipients of charitable assistance with no opportunity for meaningful participation. This despite some countries and institutions having experience in managing and responding to epidemics. Act A could therefore not embrace national and regional differences when access challenges needed to be addressed. NGOs and civil society organizations were merely used as implementing partners or for public acceptance, with little space for meaningful input in decision-making bodies, thereby ignoring their critical role in reaching hard-to-reach populations. This ultimately led to an untransparent EU-US-centric model with increasing influence of actors such as the World Bank and private donors who have limited oversight on the direct implementation of health services. The my country first approach of many high-income countries, some of them funders of Act A, caused a lack of supply for Act A. The World Health Organization proposed guidance for an equitable allocation and a fair access framework, but this was not enforceable. So no one is safe until everyone is safe also means governance must include wider perspective than Act A did. An opportunity was missed to develop a more inclusive multilateral collaboration where member states hold Act A to greater account. The one-size-fits-all model did not work, and local and regional initiatives stepped in, as we also heard from previous speakers. Secondly, there was an over-reliance on market dynamics and corporate goodwill, which impeded opportunities to diversify global production and supply of COVID-19 medical tools. Major pharmaceutical companies controlled the global production and supply of life-saving medical tools by ownership of IP, technologies and data. Despite some efforts by Act A partners, technology transfers towards low and middle-income countries were insufficient or completely lacking, not just for vaccines, but for all treatments and diagnostics. Billions of euros in public funding supported the development of COVID-19 medical tools, yet no conditions to share technology or IP rights were attached to the funding. To move away from the overall dependence on corporate voluntary actions, more than 60 countries called for a temporary waiver on intellectual property rights on COVID-19 medical tools at the World Trade Organization. Such a TRIPS waiver would provide an expedited option for governments to remove legal barriers on production and supply of COVID-19 medical tools. The European Parliament's support for the waiver has been an important voice in these prolonged negotiations. Unfortunately, the European Union, along with other high-income countries, remained strongly opposed to the proposed waiver. An inadequate outcome, known as the TRIPS decision, was adopted at the World Trade Organization last June. The decision provides the possibility for export of COVID-19 vaccines between eligible developing countries when using a compulsory license. The adopted TRIPS decision does not waive IP rights as patents or provide access to know-how or data. Neither does it cover all COVID-19 medical tools. Debates are currently taking place at the World Trade Organization to extend the product scope to diagnostics and treatments. In view of low and middle-income countries' challenges to continued challenges to access these products, such an extension should be supported. Also, a more distributed, highly adaptable production capacity is needed to enable a rapid and even distribution. The EU's recent commitment to support health sovereignty in Africa and its €1 billion investment in production capacity on the continent are important steps. Yet details of the agreements are lacking, and it's unclear how technologies and IP will be shared, which are key elements of true autonomy. So my third point, the humanitarian buffer established under COVAX failed to deliver due to an unacceptable transfer of legal risks to NGOs, leaving the most vulnerable populations unserved. The humanitarian buffer was created by COVAX as a mechanism of last resort to cover for high-risk and vulnerable populations in humanitarian settings. These populations could include people caught up in conflict or living in areas controlled by non-state armed groups, but to date all applications by NGOs to receive vaccines from this humanitarian buffer, including MSF's own application for vaccination in Syria, failed due to bureaucratic and legal negotiations around risk transfers related to liability of COVID-19 vaccines. NGOs cannot accept to take on such legal and financial risks. The transfer of risks and liability from pharmaceutical companies also sets a worrying precedent for global access to medical tools more generally. There is, however, an opportunity to better prepare for future pandemics. Existing mechanisms are currently being evaluated, and new potential instruments, as a pandemic treaty, proposed also by the EU, are being developed. There's a welcome focus on equity in some of these processes, yet the principle of equity has to be turned in concrete and enforceable actions. So I would like to finish with some recommendations. Equity should be the driving force of the global pandemic response, with meaningful engagement from civil society and organizations and low and middle income countries in design and governance. A one-size-fits-all model does not work. The role of regional bodies and institutions, as PAHO, needs to be factored in pandemic response mechanisms so responses can be tailored to needs. Governments need to attach strings to their R&D funding and use all options to share know-how and intellectual property. Access and benefit sharing mechanisms should be binding, and IP waivers should be applicable in pandemics. A more distributed and highly adaptable production capacity is needed that can enable rapid and even distribution of vaccines or other tools in the first stages of the pandemic already. Also, support for existing R&D capacities in low and middle income countries is needed. Access must be ensured for humanitarian actors, with a mechanism governing strategic stockpiling for vulnerable populations in countries with fragile health system and conflict settings. And lastly, the COVAX humanitarian buffer is not fit for purpose. The legal issues and bureaucracy posed by the scheme must be addressed as a priority. The risk transfers related to liability to other actors must be completely exceptional, time-bound, and tied to clear conditions. So thank you for giving MSF an opportunity to speak here today, and as I said, I'm welcome to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Einikel. I'll kick off for the SND. I have a few questions. What you said about the EU-US-centric model, that intrigues me a little bit. It's with regard to ACTA A, but I see your point, but at the same time, I do not regard the approach of the EU and the US as being the same approach. But maybe you can explain that a little bit. And I have a question on the role of the Gates Foundation. How does your organization looks at the role that the Gates Foundation has played in the global vaccination strategy? Coming to the TRIPS waiver, I have two questions. The first is a little bit, well, the argument that is often used against the TRIPS waiver is that you cannot waive at the same time the intellectual property rights, but also guarantee a good tech transfer. How would you look at that to solve that problem? Is it a real problem? And if yes, how to solve it? And finally, you are very critical of the role that the European Union played in initially blocking the discussion on the TRIPS waiver. But eventually there's been a compromise within the WTO. How do you look at that compromise? And I do think that the European Union at that point started to play at least a constructive role, and are now very open to open that up to diagnostics and therapeutics. And is that compromise, is that a basis for the future also with regard to the pandemic treaty? Mrs. Trélanoir, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Merci beaucoup, Dimitri, d'avoir accepté ce remplacement à la dernière minute. I will switch to English since we don't have any French translation. First of all, I would like to congratulate you in the name of Médecins Sans Frontières, which works on a daily basis and everywhere in the world to ensure that everyone has access to vaccines and treatments against COVID-19 and many other diseases. Your assistance is deployed on the ground, but you are also taking part, and you have showed it, in a major reflection on the instruments and on the methods that can today enable us to guarantee equitable access to these medicines. I am thinking in particular of the action that your association has undertaken in terms of intellectual property related to anti-COVID-19 vaccines. Now, following a complaint by yourself, MSF, to the European Patent Office, the pharmaceutical company Pfizer has recently been forced to review some of the 280 patent applications initially filed. By this action, you have demonstrated that the fact You have demonstrated and denounced the fact that Pfizer patient applications relate in part to existing knowledge through public research on mRNA vaccines on coronaviruses. Can you share with us the reasons of your action, maybe more precisely, and tell us if you have fielded prior challenges to patent applications of other manufacturers? Thank you.
You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. With regards to the critique of Act A and the point on the EU-US model, the issue is that it's largely a donor-driven model, and that's what the point of the EU-US model that I tended to say. There's a lot of influence by the donors, and there's very little input from the receiving side. While they are ready to contribute, they are ready to say and how opportunities have to be grasped, how access can be organized, and with regards to that as well, the whole point of access to technology, intellectual property rights, etc. So it's the donors, and which are largely the EU and United States, that set out the parameter of discussion and how Act A and its pillars have been organized, with a substantial influence from private donors, such as the Gates Foundation, and some of the investments for sure from the Gates Foundations are very helpful. We do not necessarily agree on all the aspects that the Gates Foundation supports or the views that the Gates Foundation has. But there's an element there of accountability. The Gates Foundation, as a private actor with a large amount of money, has a substantial influence on such decisions. But they're not accountable in that respect, while governments, which are accountable to their own populations, are feeling left behind and disempowered to take decisions on how they can serve their populations. I think we just have to imagine for one moment, if we here in the EU, if we would accept that other regions in the world, including organizations like the Gates Foundations, would have substantial influence of whether or not we would be able to access the tools that we need in this pandemic. Would the European Union citizens or MEPs in the room, would they accept that? I think they would also have questions about that, and that's a bit the key point. And that said, there needs to be improvements with Act A on inclusion of voices from the global south, civil society, more transparency, etc., which has been lacking, and a far more critical engagement with regards to the industry to really ensure access. On the point of IP and tech transfer, I think to some extent in that discussion, there are the two elements are linked, the technology transfer and the intellectual property rights. Either you have the right to produce, but you have no access to the technology, and so it will take you a lot of time to re-engineer and actually get the product to the market, or you have access to the technology, but you may not have the legal right to do so, unless they're granted both at the same time, which is a possibility in a voluntary license. We have asked all pharmaceutical companies to do that, issue voluntary licenses, share the technology, share the intellectual property rights, but they largely refuse to do so, with some exceptions, and partly some limited exceptions where just one part of the whole production process was being outsourced. So what options do countries have if they do not get access to the technology and the IP rights? That is making the case, I want to have the legal freedom to produce these tools myself. And some of them, it's easier to produce. Treatments are relatively easy to produce, some of the treatments. Some products are more difficult to produce, such as the vaccines. And we have seen endeavors in the global south and low and middle income countries that have successfully developed their own vaccines. India has its own mRNA vaccines that they have completely developed themselves, and that is actually thermostable, because I remember Mr. Gluck from a previous session about a question about refrigerators and cold chain of mRNA, but the Indian mRNA vaccine is actually possible to store it in a normal refrigerator. So just to say, there are successful developments in the global south, but they needed access and the possibility to the legal freedom to produce and to supply, and there were risks, and there are still risks of intellectual property rights preventing that, as in South Africa with the WHO mRNA tech transfer hub. And this is why we have always pushed for both elements, or asked actually for both elements at the same time. Yes, do tech transfer, but also give the opportunity to produce if that technology transfer or that legal freedom is not provided by the company. With regards, just a second, because of all the questions. With regards to the prospects to include this or with the EU position, just a second. With regards to the European Commission, well, the decision of the TRIPS decision is very meager. In a sense, the outcome, it's really the smallest possible compromise that has been made in our view, and that's the export exemption, which is which is good in itself. Now there is a possibility, at least between developing countries, for them to be able to export from one country to another. That's a positive aspect that we acknowledge. But the elements of intellectual property rights that enable to produce, which are access to know-how and data, as well as the patents, that aspect has not been touched. So the barriers that were there under intellectual property rights that will not necessarily make it super swift to produce, but over the longer time can help them to be able to produce, those have been untouched. So in that sense, we are disappointed in the outcome, as well as the fact that the scope was too limited. I agree with you that the European Union and European Commission seem to have the voice, or the position, sorry, to include diagnostics and treatments in the past. We had the same impression. I hear them backtracking a little bit on that. If I hear them speak at the moment in different fora, I'm disappointed by that. I hope they do actually publicly state that they support this. I think that's needed to bring other actors on board. And with regards to the treaty, we still hope that there are more ambitions with regards to intellectual property rights than that the TRIPS outcome or TRIPS decision actually delivered, that it would address all intellectual property barriers, and that there could be a more ambitious element. Just out of interest, it's interesting that the European Union itself is looking at these intellectual property right barriers itself in case of emergency to be overruled here in the European Union at this stage. Then on the question of the patents of Pfizer, actually it's not Médecins Sans Frontières, but it's Médecins du Monde who filed the patent opposition to the Pfizer vaccine. But yes, we have taken similar steps in the past on a number of products, not on the COVID-19 vaccines. I cannot comment so much on the specifics of the case because I'm not familiar with it because we didn't file it. But for sure, this happened before, including by us, as I said, that we did file oppositions to patents when we considered that this was actually substantially public knowledge and not innovative enough to be granted a patent. And actually, companies do that themselves towards other companies in some cases as well. So it's not a completely uncontroversial step. It's an important step. Patent oppositions need to be filed and to ensure better access to different medical tools. So I'm happy that MDM actually took on this step. I hope that answers your question.
Mrs. Metz.
Thank you for being with us, Dimitri. So global response to COVID has been reported to be unequal and inefficient from your perspective. What could have really been differently? But mainly, what should be the role of the EU in the next pandemic health emergency to make sure that we overcome inequality patterns and imbalance features in manufacturing, delivering and access to health technologies? In particular, as the pharmaceutical industry has just published its paper for pandemic preparedness, what do you believe of their proposal to rely on voluntary measures and donation to ensure supply of vaccines and medicine to low and middle income countries? And also another question I have, the WTO was too late to adequately respond to COVID-19 pandemic with a TRIPS decision covering COVID-19 vaccine only being adopted in June 2022 and no decision yet on a possible extension to the decision to COVID-19 therapeutics and diagnostic. Could you share with us why the inclusion of the therapeutics and diagnostic is so essential and what lessons should be learned to prevent such long delays in any potential future pandemic? And also for me it would be important to say that you say here how, if you could describe how IP rights impede innovation and not the other way around, as most of the time the industry tries to say us, and also how EP rights impede global access to medicine. Of course that is more evident, but I think it's important to make the point that IP rights impede innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lapisa.
Pues yo tengo dos preguntas. Muchas gracias. Hablo en español. Ha mencionado la voluntariedad de las medidas implementadas tanto en los métodos de diagnóstico como tratamientos. ¿Crees que puede tener con quién financia instituciones como COVAX, CEPI o incluso la Organización Mundial de la Salud, ¿no? Son entidades que a los ciudadanos no se nos presentan como de carácter internacional, democrático, pero sabemos que no solamente participan países, no es una asamblea de países, ya que está financiada por corporaciones privadas, fundaciones o entidades filantrópicas, ¿no? Hoy aquí mencionada Fundación Bill y Melinda o Gavi, ¿no? Estas donaciones pueden entenderse como una aportación tremendamente solidaria y necesaria, ¿no? Pero también como una financiación que genere grandes conflictos de intereses, ¿no? Influencia de los donantes. Sobre esto por un lado, comentar y otra pregunta diferente sobre el aspecto de la responsabilidad en los efectos secundarios de las vacunas donadas a través de COVAX. En Europa, la responsabilidad de estos efectos secundarios, por acuerdos con la Comisión, las debemos asumir los Estados miembros. El coste de la compensación a pacientes puede ser grande. Un país que puede tener dificultades para pagar la vacuna y que la recibe por donación, evidentemente también tendría dificultades para comprometerse en un gasto que pueda suceder de la compensación ante un efecto secundario grave. Si esto no está resuelto, pues la realidad es que los ciudadanos de estos países están expuestos a posibles malas praxis por exención de responsabilidades. ¿Médicos Sin Fronteras tiene preocupaciones en este sentido? Muchas gracias.
You have the floor.
Thank you. A lot of points to discuss with regards to what we learned from this and how we can address better in the future. Some of the points have been raised by the previous speaker, and I think there are some interesting developments going on in the United States and in CEPI, for example, specifically when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines, that there is an interest to develop what they call proto-vaccines. So to develop a type of vaccine already, as far as possible in the clinical development, so that you just need to adjust them to the right virus families. You have them basically stored somewhere in a refrigerator, or I don't know how it exactly works in practice, but you understand the point. You have them on shelf, so to say, and if there's an outbreak, you adjust them, then you do the clinical trial, and then you immediately have them available in a very short time frame. Now, that's going to require a lot of public investment. Companies themselves are not going to take on that financial risk, and so there's a lot of public investment. So the case can easily be made. First of all, why do we duplicate these efforts that this is going to happen in the United States, in CEPI, perhaps here in Europe? I don't know if HERA has ambitions in this regard. And should this not be a more pooled exercise? Should this not be more something where we have, as much as we say we need to share pathogens and genome sequencing for viruses and potential outbreaks, etc., that at the same time we make this a collaborative effort to develop such prototypes of vaccines, and that this is being kept internationally, for example, with the World Health Organization in a database, etc., that it can immediately be deployed, that the research and development is to a large extent being prepared. At the same time, we also need investments and preparedness of production capacities. I'm pleased to hear that Commissioner Schinas today said that local production is a must. We totally agree with that. I'm afraid we come from during this pandemic, we had long discussions about this point, and this was not something that was clearly acknowledged. So I'm happy it really is, and we're happy in that regard with the, as I said that in the opening statement, with the investments that Europe is taking there. But again, the element of technology transfer and IP is playing a role. That also, you need to ensure that those production capacities can be used, that they can produce something useful. So they need to have access to technologies and tools. And this relates back to the pandemic treaty then, where indeed, as previous speakers also pointed out, on the one hand, you have a request from sharing samples, genome sequences, etc., to better prepare tools. But at the same time, you need to have a commitment at the same time that you need to have access to the tools that can be followed, that can be developed based on what is being shared at an international level. Including, for example, in clinical trials. There's a lot of clinical trials that are being run in low and middle income countries, including for COVID-19 vaccines, that then were left with no access to these vaccines. This is ethically quite questionable, and there should be commitments in that regard. If you run clinical trials in a country, that of course that population has a certain guarantee of access to the products soon after that. When it comes to intellectual property rights and impeding innovation, I think an interesting case in that regard is the United States, that used the use of compulsory licensing to allow the developers, the major companies that we know, Pfizer, Moderna, Sanofi, etc., to say, well, if there are IP barriers in development, a treatment, a COVID-19 vaccine, etc., then you are allowed to override the intellectual property rights barriers of your competitors. So actually, what is the spirit of the TRIPS waiver, to some extent, has been used by the United States to allow some of these companies actually to infringe intellectual property rights of others. And it shows really that intellectual property rights can be a barrier, because if you need one component that you cannot access because your competitor is the one who has the intellectual property rights and he's not collaborating with you, then you're that can really block you in the development of your product. And there are multiple cases like this. It was mentioned before by Dr. Moon, if I remember well, the lack of collaboration as well, because you have two different she mentioned vaccines, but also for treatments this exists. You have different treatments sometimes for diseases where different competitors have the IP rights of both treatments, but you need a combination of both to be treating the disease well, for example, tuberculosis. But the two competitors do not collaborate. That's problematic, obviously, because you have the ownership rights that stand in between such aspects. When it comes to the question of PAHO, WHO, and philanthropic organizations, I think there's quite a difference between these organizations. On the one hand, WHO and PAHO are clearly, under democratic control, if I can put it that way. They are with elected officials. The member states have a voice, etc. Well, as philanthropic organizations, well, they are basically accountable to their board and whoever is representing them. And I think this is where the question of EU-US model and the philanthropic organizations comes back, that we think that surely, the accountability, the decision-making, etc., should be brought under PAHO, World Health Organization types of organizations, international organizations where the governments are leading, so to say. With regards to the secondary effects, I'm trying to remember the question. I think it was related to the liability aspects. Maybe to explain that a little bit, that to some extent it is understandable that there was an agreement that liability was transferred, or that the indemnification was taken on by the states because there was an emergency use approval. So that means the vaccines became available while it was tested on smaller population that you would hope for. But when there is final approval, at that point, for sure, the liability should be back with the manufacturer. That means that it has been tested or used on such a big population that all the severe side effects are known, and there's no question of why liability should remain with the member states. And this is why I mentioned in the opening statement, if that liability is being taken on by the states, because the state wants to have better access, for example, the EU state wants to have access to this product because it really needs it, and accepts the fact that this holds, a potential unknown risk, that has to be held with, considerations of and limitations on the price, on the agreements, etc. That it cannot be a blank check where just the liability is taken on by the state, with the company completely being no longer liable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sinsic.
Hvala vam, predsjednice. Moje pitanje za predstavnika Liječnika bez granica zapravo je isto ono koje sam postavio malo prije predstavniku Panameričke organizacije. Dakle, drago mi je na početku čuti da ste govorili o alatima za pristup covidu, a ne samo o cjepivima. Pa bih htio napomenuti, dakle, da sam imao prilike razgovarati sa brazilskim, kanadskim, talijanskim, američkim, južnoafričkim, indijskim i drugim liječnicima koji su u svojim ordinacijama i bolnicama na prvoj liniji, dakle, direktno sa pacijentima liječili te pacijente i koji su jako zadovoljni protokolima liječenja koji su razvijeni, dakle, govorimo o ranim tretmanima. Sada već postoji 2022. Nekoliko desetaka tih protokola. Htio bi izdvojiti dva možda najznačajnija. Dakle, sa listopadom ove 2022. godine lijek hidroksiklorokvin ima 367 studija koje uspoređuju tretiranu grupu i kontrolnu grupu, koje je provelo oko 6.000 znanstvenika na gotovo 500.000 pacijenata u 53 zemlje. Za rano liječenje ovaj lijek je uveden u 35 zemalja, ili njihovim dijelovima, ako se radi o recimo nekim federalnim državama, odnosno 52 zemlje ako se uključuje nevladine medicinske organizacije. Lijek, pokazuju studije, ako se koristi u ispravnim dozama i na vrijeme, pokazuje dosljedno pozitivne rezultate. Za rano liječenje poboljšanje je čak 62%, pokazuju studije. Još boljim se pokazao drugi lijek. Sa ovim mjesecom imamo 92 studije koje uspoređuju također tretiranu i kontrolnu grupu, koje je provelo oko 1000 znanstvenika na preko 134.000 pacijenata u 27 zemalja. Za rano liječenje ovaj lijek je uveden u 22 zemlje svijeta ili njihovim dijelovima, odnosno 39 ako se uključe nevladine organizacije. Ako se ispravno koristi, lijek pokazuje poboljšanje od čak 83% u profilaksiji, 62% kod ranog liječenja. Moje pitanje je kako je iskustvo vaše organizacije? Djelujete diljem svijeta sa ovim ranim tretmanima i koja je njihova uloga u suzbijanju COVID-a u zemljama u kojima djeluju liječnici bez granica? Hvala.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gluck?
Thank you. I didn't hear you because I had my
sorry.
phones on. Thank you very much. Thank you very much that you are here, and I'm really happy about that. You obviously followed also the other COVID committee meetings, which I believe is like really, really good. You mentioned a lot of really good things. So, for example, the advantages of mRNA vaccines and the possibility of a very, very fast adjustment, which is like a huge advantage compared to protein-based or vector-based vaccines. Now, one of your key points have been the TRIPS waiver, and maybe a little bit attached to what my chair said before and raised before. I would like to know, where do you see the advantage in the TRIPS waiver on one hand compared to licensing, including assistance? This is like, and you know, it's so. I try to make it simple. Okay, take a look at your Coke. I could give you all the ingredients you have in your Coke, but you would not be able to make this Coke yourself. You need assistance. You really need to know how to do that. You know, this is like the big secret of Coca-Cola. But you know, do you some sort see the difference? Because you know, we are always talking about the TRIPS waiver, and yes, we have to talk about this, of course, but we have to identify bottlenecks. And so the TRIPS waiver, and this is the huge question, is really the TRIPS waiver something we can get rid of this bottleneck? Then, and what other measures can we do to get rid of this inadequate access? So, for example, Professor Moon introduced this quid pro quo approach. So we want data on one hand, but we give you vaccines on the other hand. What's the first question? Second question, I'll make it really short. MFS report from end of 21. You identified 100 possible manufacturers of mRNA vaccines I was really surprised by that, because mRNA technology is nothing which can take place in a backyard or in a garage or something. This usually needs a very high complex environment. So could you please elaborate a little bit more of that finding, and could you maybe also tell us what do we have to do to enable those 100 companies you identified that they will be able to produce mRNA vaccines? Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was a bit long, but this is so interesting with him. Huh?
It is, absolutely. I have to say something, colleague Luc. I have a cousin who's a medical doctor and specialized in all these things, and he says you can actually make an mRNA vaccine in your backyard, but I don't have a clue. Maybe you have. But again, I don't have a clue. I have one additional question, a final question, also with regard to the proposals of Professor Moon, who made, I think, very interesting proposals. That is on our regional research and development funding pools. Instead of having all the discussions on IP rights and whatever, because it will. You know my stance on that, but sometimes I also think that we have to put too much energy in that. Why not just go immediately into another model? When it comes to pandemics, just start a new model, and these regional research and development funding pools, they seem to be very interesting, but maybe it's still science fiction. Voilà, for the final answers.
Your first question was on the TRIPS waiver, right? Yeah. So about the TRIPS waiver, as I explained, I mean, to go back to the Coke, perhaps. I mean, it's to be clear, obviously super simplified. if Coca-Cola doesn't share how to make it, you're equally stuck. And I think that's the main point. Now, the TRIPS waiver covers trade secrets, the secrecy, for example, of the filings that has been made at regulatory agencies. So if Coca-Cola, let's call it vaccines because it's easier. I don't like to talk about Coke. But you know, when a vaccine has to be approved by a regulatory agency, there have to be filings made at the regulatory agency. So they have to submit certain files with how these vaccines have been produced to some extent, not in detail. There are elements listing, but I know that. But they're not all as essential. Not every step is as essential as another. Some can be re-engineered. So they need to be regulatory filings where there is information available as well as the data, etc. This can potentially help manufacturers to re-engineer, for example, the vaccines. But as I have said before, the scope of the original TRIPS waiver did include a lot more than vaccines. It is a slow process to re-engineer vaccines. We do acknowledge that. We never shied away. In all our discussions with the Commission, but also at the Parliament, we always said the effect is going to be the quickest for treatments because they are far easier to produce. We know that, and that's what we said. So for us, they're not mutually exclusive. I understand the calls to say we would like to prefer technology transfers, but if you're remaining on a voluntary approach by the industry who's not interested to buy into that, to support that, then you have no other option anymore than to do it yourself. And again, then you may confront the intellectual property rights barriers as they do exist. On that point, let me go to the point of the mRNA vaccines, about the 100 companies. So what we did was made a profile of what kind of companies actually produced mRNA vaccines. And then I do not only talk about BioNTech and Pfizer, but also some of the contracting companies that they contracted to produce for them. For example, Lonza and Rovi in Spain. And we looked at what are the potential there. And what we saw was these companies did not produce vaccines before. These companies produce sterile injectable medicines. And that is because the process of, first of all, it's a sterile facility, so you can produce sterile products, which is essential for vaccines, obviously. But mRNA vaccines are different from conventional vaccines because they're not biological. They're largely synthetic. They're chemical. So it is possible to use those the manufacturing of those mRNA vaccines is to some extent closer to the production of some of these sterile injectable medicines. Some of the similar processes are being used, and that's exactly what Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna did by contracting these companies. And so we went and started to map with others where in low and middle income countries, where are companies that we could find, and we didn't know what we would end up with. How many companies could we identify that have a similar profile? And that actually, and that's an important point, also are countries where the company has regulatory approval to a certain level, and that the country regulatory agency, like the EMA here in Europe, but then the local regulatory agency has a maturity level 3, which is required by World Health Organization to be able to produce and export vaccines. So we matched all those arguments and then started to list the companies that we could identify. And to our surprise, we ended up with more than 100, including 9 in Africa. In Morocco, Tunisia, South Africa, Senegal, etc. So the potential, and actually from early on in the pandemic, what the industry was often saying was, we're the only ones who can do this. There's no production capacity out there. But that was wrong. That argument was not correct. I'm not saying that each of the 100 companies could do it in the end, but they had the potential to do it, indeed, if they have access to the technologies and if there are no IP barriers. On your final question, I completely agree with you on the R&D model that that's the way to go. The way to go is obviously that we avoid all these discussions in the future, that we are not stuck with intellectual property rights and technology sharing discussions in the middle of a pandemic or at the end of a pandemic, that we realized that there were other ways that we could have handled this. And this is also for us why the discussion should also, as Dr. Moon says, should also be about the R&D model that we approach. The current model is we provide public funding, but then the company has all the ownership rights of whatever the outcome of that R&D process is. And the monopoly that they have is actually the incentive, so to say, for the R&D. That's the model that is being proposed. But in reality, that doesn't match with what we would need to get quick access as fast as possible around the world, because the companies can control whatever happens afterwards. So indeed, a more pooled approach where funding is pooled, where there's collaborative efforts, international collaborative efforts being made on the R&D side to develop the tools, proto tools, or whatever you want to call them, and then that is available for anybody to be used in different continents, that's the quick way to go. And then you can adapt indeed the tools to the needs. You can adapt them to new variants, you can adapt them to new viruses, etc. So yes, we do agree with that. Oh, sorry. About your question, I'm a little bit puzzled because some of the treatments that you described, if I remember well, are not recommended by the World Health Organization. So I cannot comment on the specific protocol and the trials that you described, etc. From our side, first of all, I cannot comment on it in detail because I'm not a medical specialist in that specific area. From our side, from Médecins Sans Frontières, we always rely on WHO recommendations. They have the expertise to provide these recommendations and the treatment protocols, and we won't go beyond that. So I cannot answer your question any further than this.
Okay, that concludes the 3 hearings of today. Thank you very much, Mr. Eijnickel, for being here it's not late out, but we started really very early this afternoon, and to be here and to have that open discussion with us, as you've seen from all the issues that we dealt with today. This is a very diverse committee and with a lot of discussions on different areas, but a lot of interesting things and insights today that we will take on board in our report, and we will stay in contact also with regard to lessons learned in our report. Thank you very much, and I move to point 7, that is any other business. Voila, then we see each other again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. See you tomorrow. Thank you very much.